Hey, Galos. We'll listen to some more of the book. The White Pill, Chapter 5, we're up to. Took the weekend off. I watched highlights of it. I don't have regular TV.
And revealing him as a saboteur, a Trotskyite, a foreign spy, or a fascist. Merit being gauged by the number of your denunciations of close comrades, it is obvious that the most elementary caution demands that one
was it?
avoid all
It was a good game. Not much of a fan of either team, so.
But rather to eliminate the almost certain case of future trouble, all persons who might have not only an ordinary cheap interest in your denunciation, but an irresistible need to bring about your ruin simply because they are in danger of their own lives. In the last
I'm glad it was good. It was entertaining for you.
To its furthest and most fantastic extremes, that Bolshevik rulers have succeeded in creating an atomized and individualized society, the likes of which we have never seen before, and which events or catastrophes alone would hardly have brought about.
I think they won, right?
By design, the Soviet worldview
last second field goal or something like that.
Western bourgeois individualism. There will be some innocent victims in this fight against fascist agents, the head of the NKVD told his officers at one point. We are launching a major attack on the enemy. Let there be no resentment if we bump someone with an elbow.
A lot of money exchanged hands, I suppose.
Suffer than one spy get away. When you
some of the reactions I saw on Twitter.
Indeed, not having anyone to inform on might itself be taken as a form of guilt. If one's neighbors were all arrested for being spies or wreckers, why did the vigilant Soviet citizen not notice? A generalized sense of paranoia was heavily inculcated by the media and current events. A radio listener heard Chopin's funeral march played the day Zinoviev and Kamenev were executed and wrote in to share his suspicions that it was a signal from Trotskyite conspirators, recounted Fitzpatrick. Illiterate peasants were accused of being Trotskyists and went to prison asking what being a tractorist meant. Mere suspicion of espionage was itself a felony, carrying with it a sentence of 8 years. What this meant in practice was explained by one prisoner. Every Soviet citizen is suspected of espionage if he has ever been abroad or ever associated with a foreigner. Naturally, every foreigner is suspect. Association means any correspondence with relatives, friends, acquaintances, or professional colleagues abroad. People who were earlier sent abroad by the state itself for study or training are suspected of espionage because of these very journeys. So are the employees of diplomatic and trade missions abroad. Similarly, any encounter with a foreigner inside the Soviet Union can be dangerous. The manner in which the arrests were made was not exactly conducive to calming down the population. It was always in the middle of the night when a car could be heard stopping on a street in an era where there were very few motorists. Then would come the sound of men walking up the stairs and pounding on a door when everyone in the building was asleep. A search of the location, some evidence seized, and the suspect would be taken away. Russians joked about the relief they felt when someone knocked on their door in the middle of the night to tell them that the house was on fire. Some of the fortunate ones thought ahead to pack a bag and were allowed to bring it with them. Others were lied to about only being brought in for a brief chat. Parents innocently vanished without saying goodbye to their children, expecting to be back momentarily. One of those arrested described the typical experience. From the moment he's arrested, the prisoner is kept in constant suspense. No matter what is done to him or where he's taken, he is given no explanation. This permanent uncertainty and complete helplessness in the grip of a power.
Yeah, well, we have the draft coming up. That's pretty good. That's pretty eventful. I mean, neither one of those teams is going to get a very good first rounder unless they pay for it. But I know the Detroit Lions have 2 first-round picks.
He's never allowed to settle down. The examinations of the accused were often invasive and humiliating. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, the destructive intent of the first hours of
one of them from L.A.
to isolate the new prisoner from his fellows so that there is no one to offer him any encouragement, so that the weight of the whole elaborate apparatus bears down on him alone. Women would be taken into an underground staircase, stripped naked, and then ordered to lift their hands up. Then every crevice was examined in view of other people. Men were treated no better, being forced to spread their buttocks and demonstrate there was nothing under their genitals. Anything that could be used to harm others or...
Bunch of cops lined up here. What time is it? Hello.
Others or oneself was confiscated. One prisoner recalled how her cellmate's glasses had been taken away, of course, for anyone who had glass might use it to cut open her veins. It's unclear which situation was worse, the cells where the
State
prisoners
trooper
were
up
packed
here.
shoulder to shoulder with the room filling with the hot air of people desperate to breathe, or the cells where the prisoners were kept in complete isolation for months or even years at a time. The methods that the latter type of prisoners used to keep themselves from going insane varied from working out math problems over and over, to reciting all the poetry they'd ever heard, to closing their eyes while walking in small circles and recalling past
She got the
trips that
BAM.
they had taken. Some were kept in solitary confinement for so long that they lost the ability to speak, the muscles in their mouth having become atrophied due to lack of use. As for the former, their humanity was stripped from them as well, as they were reduced to animals in cages. The whole process of the disintegration of personality took place before the eyes of everyone in the cell. A man could not hide himself here for an instant. Even his bowels had to be moved on the open toilet situated right in the room. He who wanted to weep wept before everyone, and the feeling of shame increased his torment. He who wanted to kill himself in the night beneath the blanket trying to cut the veins in his arm with his teeth would be quickly discovered by one of the cell's insomniacs and prevented from finishing the job. Because any private relationship was a threat to the public order, the authorities took care to make sure that the prisoners themselves didn't form bonds in their captivity. Applebaum describes one NKVD order from 1935 which explicitly forbade prisoners to talk, shout, sing, write in the walls of the cell, leave marks or signs anywhere in the prison, stand at the windows of the cell, or attempt to communicate with those in other cells in any way. Worse, the prisoners would themselves be at risk if they noticed something but kept quiet about it. This is not even to mention the many informers throughout the prison system who relished the opportunity to have something to report to the authorities in exchange for bettering their own personal situation. Napping was also forbidden, so that even sleep was denied to the accused as a means of escaping their horrific reality. Strong electric lights throughout the prisons were never turned off. What might seem like a waste of precious electricity made sleeping at night difficult, especially when combined with the cramped sleeping conditions and rules forbidding prisoners from covering their faces or obscuring their hands under the blankets. Yet the interrogators themselves were also under enormous personal duress. If some of you entertain doubts and vacillations, Yezhov told his men, if some of you, for this or that reason, do not feel strong enough to cope with the Trotskyite, Zinovieite bandits, let them say so and we shall release them from the investigation. It was a beautiful piece of totalitarian doublespeak. The only reason someone might feel the need to show mercy to the plotting against the people would be some sort of sympathy with them, or some sort of squeamishness about the party's process. Themselves clear grounds for arrest, and the interrogators, more than anyone else, knew exactly what that would entail. Getting confessions out of the accused thereby became a matter of life and death for the captors themselves. Evolutionary pressures encouraged the most evil and ruthless to succeed, since what was rewarded was not serving justice, but rather getting the prisoners to confess. Not every interrogator was driven by sadism or mindless obedience. Tales abound of those who were frustrated to the highest degree by a prisoner's intransigence. They knew perfectly well that the prisoner was telling the truth about their innocence, but they resented having to work so hard in order to get them to sign their confession. As one communist explained it, the Russian communists are absolutely impregnated, more exactly infected, with this theory of two truths. One, the real truth for the initiates, for a small governing circle. The other, the lie truth for the non-initiate, great mass of the people. In its ultimate development, this philosophy of two truths has led to the lie which permeates the whole social life to the point of hypocritical and lying declarations and testimony and the monstrous trials of the penitents. People arrested for absurd reasons had little room for recourse. Conquest described how one Czech citizen is reported as having had to confess that he became a German agent early in the First World War at a time when neither Czechoslovakia nor the Soviet Union existed. Ostensibly, they could write to the authorities to set the record straight, and many wrote letter after letter to anyone and everyone, including Stalin himself. The ones who were most loyal to the party or to Stalin personally were usually the ones who took the longest to get the picture, and it was often years before they realized that no one would be coming to their aid. The guards understood the situation, with one admitting to his captive that, we never arrest anyone who is not guilty, and even if you weren't guilty, we can't release you, because then people would say that we're picking up innocent people. Stalin was perfectly aware that many of those arrested were entirely innocent. Far from the fist-pounding dictator from Hollywood films, he loved to have a good drink and tell jokes with his comrades. And just as the average man in the Soviet Union spoke forbidden truth using humor, Stalin too loved to tell a good anecdote. As he himself put it, one day a boy was arrested by the NKVD and accused of writing Eugene Onegin. That was written by Pushkin, insisted the boy. Well, a few days later, the interrogator ran into his parents on the street. Congratulations, he said. What for, they asked. Your son confessed to writing Eugene Onegin. Show trials and purges continued. One massive unanswered question remained. If there were in fact dozens of Trotsky fascist conspirators operating in the highest levels of the government of the Soviet Union, how is it that the authorities could point to one and only one person killed by all these plotters, namely Kirov? Many thousands of men and women were vanished, if not slaughtered, by the secret police. How could the class enemy, which was supposed to be pernicious, pervasive, and powerful, not claim even 1 one other victim. John Dewey and several other prominent American intellectuals sought to answer that question. Under the leadership of the seminal American progressive, the Dewey Commission investigated the evidence against Trotsky and others in order to come to an objective conclusion about what was going on in the Soviet Union. They were led to some obvious questions after the information provided by Stalin's prosecutors. It is evident, even from this incomplete list of alleged terrorist groups, that the alleged conspiracy ramified widely into Caucasia, Transcaucasia, the Ukraine, Siberia, and involved a large number of people. It is therefore astonishing, assuming that the evidence represents the truth, that it was discovered only after 5 years, according to several accused, that began in 1931, and that during those 5 years, in spite of intense activity, it resulted, according to the records themselves, in precisely one assassination, that of Commissar S.M. Kirov on December 1, 1934. The accused include Smirnov, leader of the famous Fifth Army during the Civil War, and conqueror of Kolchak; Muralov, a leader of the October Revolution in Moscow, and former commander of the Moscow military area; Mrachkovsky, one of the heroes of the Civil War in the Urals and former head of the Urals military district; Drobnis, a soldier in the Civil War, twice condemned to death by the whites and once shot by them and left for dead. These men
usually that water tower makes the disconnect.
In the service of the communist revolution and the Soviet state. It's hardly credible that if they
yeah, hockey.
to overthrow the Soviet government,
I love hockey.
they would have gone about it in such dilatory and amateurish ways. Naturally, Stalin thus turned to creating more victims, perhaps the first imaginary victims in Soviet history. Maxim Gorky was one of the greatest and most renowned authors of all time, not just in Soviet Russia, but throughout the world. As such, it was widely known that he had passed away in 1936 at the age of 68. Valerian Kubyshev had been a member of the Politburo that governed the USSR and one of Stalin's closest economic advisors. He was only 46 when he died.
Yeah, Red Wings, our local Red Wing affiliate, it's the Toledo Walleye. They're like a double A, because their Red Wings AAA team is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, but Toledo has they're pro. They've brought a few of them up, but yeah, they're mostly minor league. Minor league Red Wings. I swung out right when that cop was there. He's not even marked. Oh well. Look like he's coming. I was going a little bit accelerated.
And Minjinsky had all died of natural causes. Yezhov set to work. He realized that he wouldn't need to break all 3 doctors. All he had to do was to break one and then have him turn on his 2 colleagues. He thus set his sights on Professor Dmitry Pletnev, who had a reputation as the most outstanding heart specialist in the USSR. One of Yezhov's female NKVD operatives accused Pletnev of having bitten her breast in the course of examining her 3 years prior. It was completely false and utterly
Wife's not having a good day. I'm going to try and reach out to her.
After decades of hard work, the doctor's reputation was reduced to the newspaper's new epithet for him, the sadist Pletnev. The respected medical professional was then publicly denounced by former friends and students, now that they had much choice in the matter. Over the years of his career, Pletnev had treated some of the most prominent citizens of the Soviet Union, all of whom now ignored his desperate letters beseeching them to help clear his name. The second target, Dr. Levin, had treated both Stalin and his daughter, though such connections did him little good. Dr. Kazakov was the final target of the accusations. One at a time, the men were sat down and told what they had done. Yezhov's predecessor, Yagoda, had summoned each of them individually and demanded they murder their patients. The court heard testimony that the doctor poisoners took Gorky from an overheated room and into freezing cold over and over until he died. The men had supposedly been too afraid to defy Yagoda and either warn their patients or turn him in, despite personally having direct access to the highest official itself. Pletnev was spared death, but Kazakov and Levin were executed. In any event, Kirov was legally no longer the sole victim of those plotting against Stalin and his men. Chapter 6. Try to imagine what it is like. No shortage of simple brutality to effect a confession, though very few resisted. The Polish-born Konstantin Rokossovsky was a brilliant military man and great innovator when it came to the art of modern warfare. He was 40 years old when he was arrested, and Yezhov's men began to work him over for claims of being a spy and a foreign agent. They broke his ribs and smashed his toes with a hammer. The NKVD
Sorry, that was the wife. Patient confidential stuff.
The man pulled out his fingernails and up his teeth as well. When that was not enough, they told him that he was going to be executed, taking him in front of firing squads, but never actually shooting him. But Rokossovsky never broke, and when he was later freed and worked alongside Joseph, Man of Steel Stalin, against the forces of Hitler,
Oh, I prefer hockey, I guess.
The physical brutality committed against the accused was invariably
professional football's really not
here, and this was by
much my thing. I prefer college football before they get too jaded.
Rather than later. One prisoner recalled the effect such a human sounds had on her. I thought about the fact.
I mean, there's already money in college football. There has been forever. Now it's legal money, so it's going to get the same way. But
upon him like beasts. At a certain point, the accused understood, and in his agony cried out to the only loyal name left to him, "Mom, Mom, my head!" She and all the others heard him scream over and over. Sometimes the pressures weren't so brutal in their application. The tale of the pseudonymous Comrade Ivanov was one such example. An old Bolshevik with an impeccable pedigree, he had repeatedly been arrested by the Tsar. After the revolution, they were deported to Siberia before being brought back and imprisoned in Moscow in 1936. It took 4 months of trying to break Ivanov, but old Bolsheviks don't break easily. What was 4 months in a Moscow prison to a man who had done 10 years doing hard labor in some godforsaken corner of Russia? Eventually, Yezhov himself attempted to discover what was taking so bloody long. After seeing Ivanov refusing to break, Yezhov simply phoned Ivanov's mother-in-law in the man's presence. "This is the NKVD. Comrade Ivanov wants to know how his children are." It was the middle of the night, she told him, and the younger boy was sound asleep. "Do you want me to give her a message?" Yezhov asked Ivanov. "Tell her to take good care of the boy," Ivanov replied. The Bolsheviks did in months what the hated Tsar couldn't do in a decade. They broke Paul Ivanov. He cried when they hung up the phone and signed whatever confessions they put in front of him. Historian Orlando Figgis points out that in 1935, the Soviet government had lowered the age of criminal responsibility to just 12, partly with the aim of threatening those imprisoned with the arrest of their children if they refused to confess to their crimes. A second decree that year allowed the arrest and imprisonment of relatives of anyone who was imprisoned for crimes against the state. In effect, a hostage system was declared.
Yeah, we're at chapter 6 now.
No unofficial practice for quite some time. It was one of the ways that the Bisperodny, the orphans of war and famine, had been called in previous years.
I'm going to bring it back up on the laptop when I get into the office.
Teenagers liable for the death penalty caused an enormous backlash in even communist-friendly Western circles.
Maybe.
By making it official, certain other actions were now not only possible, but in a sense unremarkable. It was Yezhov's policy for his interrogators to have a copy of the decree on their desks. We are also told, recounted Conquest, that fear of reprisals was made more dramatic and emotionally effective by the display on the interrogator's desk of private belongings of members of the family. It's amazing what human beings will do when their families are threatened and when they're aware of how little they can do to save them. Eventually, every inquisitor of the NKVD was obliged to have on his desk during the interrogation of the arrested Bolsheviks the law which decreed the application of the death penalty to children. But even this wasn't the worst of what was done to get confessions out of various men and women. Stanislav Kosyor had been instrumental in implementing Stalin's assault on the Ukrainian peasantry. One of the surviving photos of Kosyor has him seated in a row directly below Stalin. Stalin has his hand atop Kosyor's bald head, and the two men both have big goofy smiles on their faces. It was a bit out of character for Bolsheviks who were meant to look tough and ruthless. As General Secretary of the Ukrainian SSR Communist Party, it was Kosyor who issued several decrees imposing the confiscation of grain as well as deporting thousands of families. He was also complicit in covering up the causes of the mass famine, using the Ukrainians themselves as scapegoats for the millions that died. In December 1933, Kosyor addressed the All-Union Central Executive Committee of the Soviets. There he offered up an alternative history wherein Stalin was saving the Ukrainians instead of decimating them. Throughout the 2-year period, much as we tried to revive the agricultural economy, we failed to do it. You, comrades, all know that considerable aid in the form of food and seeds was given not only to Ukraine, but also to other districts and regions of the Soviet Union. This must be credited to the exceptional persistence on the part of Comrade Stalin, who succeeded in accumulating, even under such circumstances, certain reserves that were afterwards used to aid a number of provinces. These reserves helped considerably to plug the gaps that were a result of our errors in many localities. Stalin's purge made its way through the Soviet power structure to silence virtually anyone who knew too much about his atrocities. Kosyor had insisted that the causes of the Holodomor lay not in objective conditions, but mainly in the low quality of our local work, the caliber of our local leadership. But Kosyor knew perfectly perfectly well what had caused the famine, and that forbidden knowledge was itself largely enough to sign his literal death warrant. In January 1938, Stalin recalled Kosyar to Moscow and made him Deputy Prime Minister of the USSR. He was arrested 4 months later. There are few of us who know what it means to experience torture. The closest analog is an action movie. The hero's tied to a chair with his hair carefully tousled and his lips slit open. Though exhausted, he's defiant against his captors. His refusal to back down is both a source of frustration to his foes and a testament to his strength. It is a powerful image, but also a...
You're going to fill out a form, or else you're not going to film.
I'm not filming out a form.
You're going to have to call Denver Police.
should-
I don't
that's
give
all
a
I care
damn.
about.
You and your
Yeah.
constitution,
What
you
happened?
can
Just
stick it.
happened.
Try me.
The fuck?
Hollywood fabrication. Historian William O'Neill pointed out that tortures weren't simply used by Stalin's men to get a confession, but also to effect the complete disintegration of his individual personality. As O'Neill explained, a man woken up in the middle of the night, unable to satisfy his most elementary physical needs during the hearing, sitting for hours at a time on a small hard stool, blinded by the light of a powerful bulb directed straight in his eyes, surprised by sudden cunning questions, and by the
fuck is
overwhelming
this?
crescendo of fictitious accusations, sadistically taunted with the sight of cigarettes and hot coffee on the other side of the table, and all this going on for months, sometimes even years. Under these circumstances, he is ready to sign anything. That, however, is not the essential point. A prisoner is considered to have been sufficiently prepared for the final achievement of the signature only when his personality has been thoroughly dismantled into its component parts. Gaps appear in the logical association of ideas, thoughts, and emotions, become loosened in their original positions and rattle against each other like the parts of a broken down machine. The driving belts connecting the past with the present slip off their wheels and fall sloppily to the bottom of the mind. All of the weights and levers of mind and willpower become jammed and refuse to function. The indicators of the pressure gauges jump as if possessed from 0 to maximum and back again. The machine still runs on larger revolutions, but it does not work as it did. All that had a moment before appeared absurd now becomes probable, even though still not true. Emotions lose their color, willpower, its capacity. The prisoner is now willing to admit that he had betrayed the interests of the proletariat by writing to his relatives abroad that his slackness at work was sabotage of socialist industry. It is unclear what torture methods were attempted on Kosyar to get a confession. The most frequently used was known as the conveyor, where the prisoner is not allowed to sleep and is questioned endlessly. Every 4 hours, his interrogator would be replaced by a new fresh man, just like a conveyor belt, and so the questioning would resume again of a cartoon. Prisoners who were beaten to death were legally registered as having had heart attacks. In some cases, the murder was more extreme, such as when the head of the cross-examined prisoner is tightly bound with cord into which a small stick, a nail, or a pencil is inserted. By rotating this inserted stick, the cord wound around the skull tightens to such an extent that finally the skull is scalped, the skin with the hair of the head coming clean off the skull. Did Kosyar stare down his captors with anger? Did he taunt them through the blood and pain, one eye half closed? Did he beg, ask to speak with Stalin, or demand it? Did he insist on his innocence until his voice went hoarse? Or did he save his energy and breath, knowing there was no point? If Kosyar had to stand in water for days on end, he did not break. If the NKVD subjected him to the swallow, where he was hoisted up by his arms and legs tied behind him, he did not break. It is unknown whether Kosyar's refusal to break earned him the grudging respect of his captors or simply angered them more. It remains unclear whether they had their eventual ace in the hole the entire time and were toying with him, or if their idea only came when nothing else seemed to work. Or perhaps there was a line even the NKVD wanted to avoid crossing if there remained any possibility
Something like
of
that.
avoiding it. What we do know is that the interrogators brought in Kosyar's 16-year-old daughter Tamara and raped her in front of him. That did it. That finally broke Stanislav Kosyar. Kosyar duly signed the confession that he, an ethnic Pole, had been a Polish spy. His execution was not immediate. He managed to outlive Tamara, who committed suicide by throwing herself in front of a train. Whether Tamara's death should technically be counted as one of the NKVD's victims is an academic question. It is unlikely it was she who the New York Times had in mind when they published a 2017 opinion piece explaining why women had better sex under socialism. But history has at least recorded her name, unlike those of so many thousands of others whose very existence has been entirely wiped away. The trials as a whole left viewers worldwide with a logical dilemma. It was Granville Hicks himself who pointed out that there were only two real conclusions one could draw from the events. If these men were innocent, he wrote years later, the administration of the Soviet Union was a vicious, ruthless tyranny. But if, on the other hand, they were guilty, then the leadership of the communist movement had been desperately corrupt from the very beginning. Yet the show trials were even on, or rather especially on, those men and women who were Western media influencers of their time. As George Orwell put it, what was frightening about these trials was not the fact that they happened, for obviously such things are necessary in a totalitarian society, but the eagerness of Western intellectuals to justify them. Take the case of Dorothy Parker. She was the Samantha Bee of her day, and her comrade James Thurber, the Stephen Colbert. The two were part of the famous Algonquin Round Table, which spent the 1920s meeting for lunch every day and exchanging bon mot in New York City's Algonquin Hotel. The group was strongly associated with the New Yorker magazine and its sensibilities. As Parker herself later described it, they came there to be heard by one another. Did you hear what I said last night? People look at it rosily now, and it wasn't. I promise you, it was no good. It was the terrible day of the wisecrack, so there didn't have to be any truth. There was nothing memorable about them, about any of them. A century later, Parker remained synonymous with American wit and was probably the first woman in the United States to be known for her sharp tongue.
Hello.
Hi.
All right. Sorry about that.
Her life story was made into an inexorable 1994 film entitled Mrs. Parker in the Vicious Circle, wherein Jennifer Jason Leigh drunkenly stands up and spontaneously delivers Parker's sayings in front of various audiences over the course of 90 minutes. Though Parker never did write that, if you don't have anything nice to say about someone, come sit next to me, it certainly does read in her voice. As a theater reviewer, she quipped that, I know who wrote those lyrics, and I know the names of the people in the cast, but I'm not going to tell them. When an editor pressured her for overdue work, she replied that she was too fucking busy, and vice versa. Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses was originally a couplet of hers entitled News Item, and there was that wholesale libel in the Yale prom. If all the girls attending it were laid end to end, Mrs. Parker said, she wouldn't be at all surprised. Parker was also a strong advocate of social justice and threw aside her trademark sarcasm and irony when it came to the issues that mattered to her. In 1927, it was the Sacco and Vanzetti case.
Oh, I answered. I muted it though.
Anarchists were accused of murdering a bank guard during an armed robbery and accordingly sentenced to death.
She's asking about the iPads.
Taken with the cause of the immigrant men, and the case dragged on for years. In 1927, Parker was arrested and fined a paltry $5 for loitering and sauntering after taking part in a rally for their defense. It would be to no avail. The pair would be electrocuted in August of that year. Yet when it came to Stalin's trials of innocent men, Parker and her comrades had an entirely different approach. As literary critic Lionel Trilling wrote in his 1966 essay,
Told her the same thing I told her the day we registered them. They have to do something on their end for it to work. Everything that I can do, I did.
The American intellectual class as we now know it in its great size and influence. It fixed the character of this class as being, through all mutations of opinion, predominantly of the left. And quite apart from opinion, the political tendency of the 30s defined the style of the class. From that radicalism came the moral urgency, the sense of crisis, and the concern with personal salvation that marked the existence of American intellectuals. Indeed, a large cross-section of the American intelligentsia tripped over themselves to defend Stalin's purges and the executions that followed as a result of them. A letter to that effect was published.
Yeah, so they went a week without doing anything about it, and now it's Monday again, and they're freaking out. So
the same exact day that Stanislav Kosior was arrested. Parker's name was easy to miss among the many signatories. It was below that of Granville Hicks. None of the people who added their names to the letter had a gun to their head. It was their free choice to go out of their way to make known their support of Stalin's actions and to take a public stand on his behalf, to use their elevated status to let average Americans know how important it was for the Soviet Union to have the right, if not the duty, to execute its own citizens. We, the undersigned, are fully aware of the confusion that exists with regard to the Moscow trials and the real facts about the situation in the Soviet Union, it began. Simply put, the reports of the trials have, by sheer weight of evidence, established a clear presumption of the guilt of the defendants. The basic American liberal concept of a presumption of innocence until proven guilty, a basic element of human rights designed to protect the powerless against the accusatory state, was gladly flipped on its head. In fact, the influencers claimed, most newspapers have discarded the earlier charges of frame-up and now admit the validity of the trials. This might have been perhaps less of a commentary on the validity of the trials than on the decency of most newspapers. The alleged point of the confusion was in part to obscure the truth about the achievements of the Soviet Union as recorded by honest progressive opinion. These achievements supposedly included magnificent gains in industry and agriculture. The letter went on to repeat Stalin's claim that defendants resorted to duplicity and conspiracy and allied themselves with long-standing enemies of the Soviet Union. Degeneration may therefore be charged to the defendants and not to the Soviet Union, which gained strength internally and externally by the prevention of treason and the eradication of spies and wreckers. Eradication, of course, being a euphemism for the death penalty, with wreckers in practice being anyone who is disobedient or even skeptical or has simply been accused of it. But again, any setbacks in the Soviet Union weren't the fault of communism, the USSR, or Stalin. It was the fault of those men who had been captured and imprisoned. By this point in time, there had already been concern in Hollywood and in Washington over those Americans who preferred the USSR to the United States and were secretly plotting with the Soviet government. Members of the Communist Party of the United States were complaining about the personal costs of joining the party when their beloved communist country made membership in any other political party, even in the past, grounds for imprisonment, labor camps, and certain death. In an amazing bit of projection, the celebrities claimed that the Soviet Union's growing vitality and self-defense measures restrained its foes from open attack, so that the opponents of the Soviet Union have therefore been forced to resort to covert means. Supposedly, these enemies have disseminated reactionary propaganda and financial patronage within the USSR. It was not that Soviet agents had been placed throughout the West, but the other way around. If anything, it was Hitler who was pulling the strings in US circles, not Stalin. No one denies the penetration of the American continent by fascist propaganda. The letter ended by asking American liberals to support the efforts of the Soviet Union to free itself from insidious internal dangers. In other words, not only were the purges and the hundreds of thousands sent to camps something to tolerate or explain away, no, Stalin should have the backing of every good American leftist with a conscience. As the motto went, communism is 20th century Americanism. The same editors and writers who once spoke up for Sacco and Vanzetti, Lyons later wrote, who presumably cherished the memory of the world response to a Dreyfus or a Mendel Baylis case, now gave every benefit of the doubt to an omnipotent state and its firing squads rather than to its victims. There were no intellectual acrobatics which the fellow travelers would not undertake to save their lovely faith in Russia. Year after year, they had accepted and
Sorry guys, driving.
Super horror, falsifications of history, corruption, terror, man-made famine, the death penalty for minor thefts, the punishment of relatives for alleged crimes.
Calls are, I'm gonna be down for about a half hour once I get there because I got to deal with some people, and it's going to take me a minute to set up, but I want to resume this because I want to listen to the rest of this book today.
The Englishman H.G. Wells was a major pioneer in the field of science fiction, with books The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, and The Invisible Man, still widely read today.
I got people waiting in my office already, so
socialism, which is the fiction.
I didn't think I had any appointments till 2, but they're already here, so.
The experts would know exactly how much and what needed to be produced, and they would make that and only that. In 1934, Wells had become one of the lucky few, either from the USSR or abroad, who managed to interview the surprisingly reclusive Stalin. At one point, regarding the imminent collapse of capitalism as a functioning system, Wells chided Stalin, saying that, "It seems to me that I am more to the left than you." While Wells had a strong reputation of being a socialist in the United Kingdom, he also had a strong reputation in general. If Stalin was more to the center than Wells, then clearly the leader's ideology couldn't be all that bad. By definition, it wasn't that extreme if the mainstream Wells was further to the fringe than Stalin was. "I have never met a man more candid, fair, and honest," Wells wrote of Stalin, and it is to these qualities and to nothing occult and sinister that he owes his tremendous, undisputed.
I might just bring you guys in on
George Orwell was a
on the
hardcore
phone.
leftist throughout his life, and like so many others,
We're up to 7, so I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna leave the phone going. I'll just carry it in there.
Between a broad coalition of leftists, from Stalinists to anarchists, against the ultra-nationalist forces of Francisco Franco, was in many ways perceived to be a proxy for the growing European conflict
That is
between
Michael
fascism
Malice.
and its opponents. What Orwell
The White
saw
Pill,
from
Chapter 6 we're on.
against authoritarian communism, becoming one of its fiercest and most perceptive critics with his masterpieces 1984 and Animal Farm. As he later put it, "Every line of serious work that I've written since 1936 has been written directly or indirectly against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism, as I understand it." Yet in 1938, Orwell's British publisher Victor Gollancz refused to publish Homage to Catalonia, Orwell's memoir about his Spanish experience and what he saw as communist duplicity against their supposed allies. Gollancz had co-founded the Left Book Club, a list that catered to socialists and published several exclusive titles. To paraphrase Orwell's famous quote, some leftists were more equal to others, and criticism of Stalinist communism was not to be done. The upshot is that, Orwell wrote, if from time to time you express a mild distaste for slave labor camps or one candidate elect, or actuated by the worst motives. Another prominent British intellectual was the aforementioned Harold Laski, whose political career would culminate in becoming the UK's Labour Party chairman. He went even further than most, making a point to praise Stalin's prosecutor as doing what an ideal minister of justice would do if we had such a person in Great Britain. Lasky would eventually get in trouble for announcing that if Labour did not obtain what it needed by general consent, we shall have to use violence, even if it means a revolution. It's understandable why Lasky was the inspiration for the villain in Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. In Lasky, Rand saw the man who couldn't be and knows it, someone who hated the good because it was the good. As she recalled, after seeing Lasky, I just had to remember how he lectured, his mannerism, the pseudo-intellectual snideness, the whole manner of speaking on important subjects with inappropriate sarcasm as his only weapon, acting as if he were a charming scholar in a drawing room, but you could sense the bared teeth behind the smile. You could feel something evil. Pat Sloan was a British communist who spent some time in the USSR. He freely told his fellow citizens that, compared with the significance of that term in Britain, Soviet imprisonment stands out as an almost enjoyable experience. For the essence of Soviet imprisonment is isolation from the rest of the community, together with other persons similarly isolated, with the possibility to do useful work at the place of isolation, to earn a wage for this work, and to participate in running the isolation settlement or prison in the same way as the children participate in running their school or the workers their factory. The Soviet labor camp provides a freedom for its inmates not usual in our own prisons in this country, he went on to say. Yet it's not merely the left-wing fringe of the intellectual class that came to such conclusions. The Nation and the New Republic were and remain highly respected outlets that Americans turn to learn about the issues of the day and how they should feel about them. As Lyons commemorated, what was the Nation's first reaction to the announcement of the initial Trotskyist trial? Not even decent astonishment. It was to be expected that under the velvet glove of the new Soviet Constitution, he wrote, there would still be the firm outlines of the Iron Hand. There could be no doubt the dictatorship in Russia is dying and that a new democracy is slowly being born. The impending death of thousands of communists was thus another confirmation that the dictatorship is dying. The gallant New Republic, in its first reaction, blandly assumed that the fantastic charges compounded by the GPU were true. Perhaps the deepest lesson to be learned from the Russian trial, it declared, is the profound, unchangeable stubbornness of human nature. From the standpoint of practical expediency, these men had little to gain and much to lose by their effort to bring down the Soviet state in ruins. Perhaps the deepest lesson here might not be about the profound, unchangeable stubbornness of human nature. Rather, it might have something to do with the profound, unchangeable stubbornness of the Nation, the New Republic, and other such journals. The very same outlets that still presume to hector Americans on a daily basis about ethics and decency without shame or even irony. As horrific as it was for Stalin and his men to turn family members into hostages, they weren't always used to leverage confessions or the like. Loyalty to family was a quintessentially bourgeois worldview, the private interest over the public good, and any hint of that was anathema to good communists. Husbands and wives turned against one another with ease. Just being married to an enemy of the people was in and of itself illegal, a crime that a husband, or far more frequently a wife, could do very little to deny. Things were even stricter for those in the military. Starting in 1934, a military man who fled when abroad would subject not merely his spouse, but his entire family to get sent to a prison camp. Mikhail Kalinin was chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet, the Soviet Union's head of state, but even that could not protect his wife from being arrested, tortured, and sentenced in 1938 to 15 years for supposedly being aligned with Trotsky. Kalinin knew better than to protest and dutifully carried on with his work. Polina Zhemchuzhina was Vyacheslav Molotov's wife. His name remains with us in part due to the Molotov cocktail, invented by the Finns to fight the Russians. Molotov was second only to Stalin, and Zhemchuzhina served as Moscow's de facto first lady after Stalin's second wife killed herself, or was she in 1932. When Stalin announced the arrest of yet another espionage rig, Molotov suspected that his wife would be included in the group. What will become of Polina Semyonovna, he asked. What question? Stalin barked. Vyacheslav Mikhailovich still doesn't know how the Soviet government deals with imperialist spies. Molotov's wife was soon arrested and sentenced to 5 years in a labor camp. Nor was Stalin's own family safe. He personally approved the execution of his first widow's brother, his very own brother-in-law, which was carried out with all good haste. Her mother was arrested and imprisoned as well. Stalin's second widow's brother-in-law was likewise shot. As marriage itself thereby became fraught with danger, so did the Soviet system attempt to use children against their own parents in other ways. Just as George Washington was mythologized as having admitted in his boyhood to chopping down a cherry tree because I cannot tell a lie, the Soviet authorities developed folk heroes of a sort in order to spread moral messages on desirable behavior among the population. Most notorious of these was the story of Pavlik Morozov, a young boy who turned in his kulak father to the authorities for hoarding grain. Pavlik was then allegedly killed by his dad. In doing so, he became a martyr throughout the USSR with statues built in his honor. The message was so unambiguous, even a child could understand it, because of course the story was targeted precisely toward children. If your parents break the law, there is no higher moral response than to turn them in, even if it costs you your own life. The youngest themselves were not free from being arrested and put on trial, and getting them to confess was child's play. It only took a single night of interrogation to get one 10-year-old detainee to admit that he had joined a fascist organization at the age of 7. Other kids who were not suspects themselves were forced to publicly approve of the arrests and executions of their parents for having been spies. Their entire class or school would assemble, and the student would be berated until they denounced their mother and or father in front of their fellow classmates.
I got people here
Children had
waiting.
been Bolshevik
I'm not going to
targets
try and
from the
bring you guys
beginning.
down there.
Russian author Sergei Maslov recounts the May 1920 arrest of a band of Moscow pickpockets, all between the ages of 11 and 15. The children were confined in a cellar and isolated from the other
There's a
prisoners.
lot here.
Threats and promises of reward were
All right, I'll leave it
ultimately
running.
used to
Fuck
make
it.
the children point out their accomplices. After some fruitless attempts to make them speak, several employees of the Cheka entered the cellar, pounded the children with their fists, and having knocked them down, kicked them with
29 minutes left. All right, I'm going to get you guys in there. I got some unpacking to do, so you're not going to be hearing shit for a while, but I will be talking to them. It looks like these people waited, so we're going to give them the courtesy. Ah, fuck. All right. All right. Somebody with handicap plates is applying. Oh yeah. Stash this in the back for now. All right. Afternoon, I guess. How you doing, folks? Just give me a couple minutes, get some things set up here. It's chilly down here. Which facility were you guys looking for work?
Here, please.
Vectrum Foods?
Yes.
Okay.
That's
Yeah. Well, I can get you guys ready, but right now they're not bringing on more folks. But as soon as when they do, it's all of a sudden. So if I already have you ready, have the safety portion of it done with you and stuff like that, I can call you and say, hey, they're ready. No, I can tell you that most of the work is done over at the building on Telegraph. This is just the mix plant here. In the test facility.
Oh, I just live down the street, that's why I was like, what is the?
Yeah, this is just the mix plant. I mean, my office is here. Most of the work is done. It's not far. It's right now. It's north of Dunbar. But yeah, even when they do start bringing folks on, usually it's not for this building. I mean, unless it's a mixed plant position or something like that. And those are pretty rare. To bring folks into this building itself. Like I said, I could get you ready and stuff like that, and there are positions that spring up once in a great while, but it's pretty rare for this building. Now, we do have, I mean, if you have transportation, we do have immediate positions at a facility in Temperance. It's not Spectrum Foods. Place is called Syncreon.
How much they starting off over there?
It's over 1450. I know that. So there's a couple. There's like a $1.50 an hour attendance bonus that goes with it. There's a shift bonus as well. It's mostly evening shifts.
I think you might still have my file up under yours though.
Okay. Well, I mean, it's, yeah, either way, it would be launching from here. It's just, our goal is to get you hired in wherever we place you, so. Okay. All right. How'd you hear about us? Just seen the signs?
No, one of my neighbors had told me about it.
Okay.
I pass her all the time.
Oh, yeah.
I'm like, oh,
Like I said, things do open up once in a while. Once in a while, there'll be a quality position opening up here or something like that. But like I said, it's pretty rare. Most of the time, most of the production positions and stuff like that are at the building over on Telegraph. See where we're at. It's not working. Okay. Dude. Sorry. All right, let's get logged in here and see where we're at. All right. What was your last four, sir?
0812.
Yeah, Mario, all we would have to do is whenever something does open up is give you a call, have you come in. It'll take us 15 minutes to do the safety stuff. You've got enough of it done. Do you want to be on the waiting list?
Yeah, what's up with the one in Temperance?
Okay, well, that's called Syncreon.
They
They
hired Usher over there.
You have transportation? Okay, we'll have a seat.
Temperance ain't that far.
Nope.
Straight up to the ground.
Down Tugger, yeah. All right, let's see what we need to do to update you. Now, the way it works there is I set you up for an interview.
grab my phone.
Oh, go ahead, go ahead. I set you up for an interview with them. Goes well, they'll invite you back the next day for orientation. Now, their orientations are paid. All right, so just give me a second, this is important. Hey, dude, what is up with this Cindy, dude? She's sending me hours from last week, which she's supposed to do on Monday, but not from the previous week. She's like, I sent them to you. I'm like, no, you didn't. You sent them for Matt Johnson, and she didn't reply to that. They're gonna. This kid just wants to get.
So is it for last?
The week before last for Dustin Bear, we got Matt Johnson's because she sent those hours, but right in the email it says Matt Johnson.
Yeah, well, just respond back to her before that way.
No, those hours are for last week
Oh,
because it's 40 hours. They start, the week before he hasn't been paid for though. And that's what I was trying to convey on Friday. And he turned one. He made them both come in, or she made them both come in and turn in those timesheets because they turned them in to the person that they did orientation with, and apparently that person didn't turn them in. So she made those two come in and redo their timesheets, and then still didn't submit Dustin's because he put the wrong dates on it. She's like, well, she replied back with, well, make sure he's more thorough next time. I'm like, yeah, well, maybe next time, just report him, and we won't have to make him come in to do that. But I didn't say that, of course.
Right,
But yeah, we still need Dustin's hours for the week before last. Last week, that's fine. We'll hang on to them, but we still need Matt's for last week too. I don't know why. What is this? What is the difficulty?
oh my God, I just was able to open the box, I just got the key for this box.
Mm-hmm.
Lord Jesus, help me.
Oh, the request dates?
The suggestion box, please, there's a whole bunch of shit in here.
Oh, great. That ought to be awesome. But yeah, I mean, I don't want to send those in to be done until we have both of their hours. I'm gonna send them both together. That way there isn't an issue. I mean, and I'm getting ready to start sending a lot more people. If we don't, they better get this squared away. I mean, she tells me over and over again they don't need operators every time I'm trying to send forklift drivers. And then the end of week last week, they need 10 operators. Like, okay. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, she still hasn't sent me that kid's hours for the week before last.
She's a mess. Did you see that email where she asked, like, what is this for? Is this for operator forklift? But in the below email, it clearly says.
Yeah, I saw that.
The forklift interview.
I saw that. I saw that. That's why I'll put it both in the title now and in next to their name because they don't understand. There's some difficult issues going on there. So, but yeah. So hopefully they get this squared away. But I mean, the thing is that most of the times I'm not responding until the afternoon because I'm going in to hit that place in the evening. So. Every time if I send a response later on today, she's not going to respond back to me until tomorrow. I mean, Dustin needs to be paid today for 2 weeks ago. We need to get his hours. All right, fine. I'll do it. You're not going to like my response if you let me do it.
Yeah, because on Wednesday,
Okay.
she already had it from the last time,
All right.
from when I.
And once again, I'll keep everybody copied and I'll add Gina to it. So.
Oh my God, Friday,
Hey, Hey, let's get caught up a little bit later. I have 3 people in the office here, so. All right, bye. Jeez. Care about your weekend. Just want to try and make sure people get paid. That's my objective. If things get messed up, I'm going to go 100% to make sure things get fixed for you guys because it's ridiculous. It's not hard to do it right. It's not hard to do it right. For some folks, I guess it might be. Okay, Mario, I'm gonna just reset your login.
Okay, it's a money 2023 with a money sign.
Oh, you don't need to tell me what your password is. No, it's gonna be the temp 123 exclamation. It's gonna ask you to change it though. You change it to whatever you want. Yeah, we don't want to know your password. Your username is just your first name dot last name though. Okay. I'm gonna switch this over to applicant so you can update your info. And you can do it on the computer or on your phone, either way. Just do the employee login. All right. I was listening to a book. I need some kind of soothingness, some Russian Tsar shit in the background here.
Why don't you go? Go back into your house.
So, did you guys want to proceed? Do you guys want to get you in the system so you're ready for when they are calling for folks, or how do you want to proceed today?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Please.
No, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have you. I've got a few people. All these aren't people. people waiting. It's I do have a few, and last week they did call for a couple people, so I'm thinking it's going to start. They're going to when they. So usually it's only going to be for Telegraph. Okay.
I'll still fill in, because
yeah.
I don't have a car, but.
Okay, no, and then and I'll just write on their front street for your on your folder. That way, I mean, things do open up, and usually when something opens up here too, they want to fill it up fast. Okay.
Please,
Have you ever worked with us before?
no.
Okay, it'll actually be easier. If you have a seat at that computer right there, I'll help you. Or if you want to do it on your phone, you want to do it on your phone? That's fine. Just do the mobile application. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm trying to, but it won't, every time I do it, it says web page.
Do you want to connect to the Wi-Fi? The Wi-Fi password's on the top of the drawer right here, of the file cabinet. The file cabinet I'm pointing at, right? Yeah, the front of it, where it says IES wireless.
Yeah.
Oh, duh.
It's okay. Yeah, just jump on the Wi-Fi because we're in a basement here, so
Okay.
it does get hard to connect. And believe me, your phone will move faster than those computers. These things are like 15 years old. The internet's fast. It's just those computers are ancient. Okay. All right. So yeah, there's two shifts, Mario. B crew is Wednesday through Saturday. That's 5 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. Okay, solid 4 days in a row. They're 10-hour shifts, so 40 hours. Now C crew is kind of a swing shift, but it gives you your weekend nights off. It's Monday and Tuesday 5 p.m. to 3:30 a.m. and then Friday and Saturday 5:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. So they're hiring for both of those shifts. Okay. Yeah. The base rate is 15, but then there's a $1.50 an hour attendance bonus, and there's a shift differential as well for working nights. Okay. So. All right. So yeah, you should be ready. Were you able to log in?
At first I did get in there, but then it kept saying an error. I don't know if it was like the Wi-Fi or something.
Yeah, it's the Wi-Fi password is right on the drawer behind you there. All right, let's get some. Yeah, the evening shifts do pay the differential. Audible.
Daily about the town on trams, in motor cars, and taken to railway stations to point out their accomplices. At first, the children tried to pretend they knew no one. They were still more barbarously beaten that night, and they began to betray their associates. This torture went on for a fortnight. If a child had the bad luck not to meet or point out a comrade, he would be cruelly thrashed. To escape the savage punishment, the children finally pointed out innocent boys whom they did not know. After 3 weeks of this, the young thieves were like small blunted animals expecting an imminent death. They sobbed, trembled, and shrieked in their sleep. The adult inmates, prisoners themselves, have never heard such heartrending cries.
Yeah, it's because we're part of the Ohio region.
They understood that they were going back to the cellar. There was a brief moment when children in several large cities organized an attempt to fight back, calling themselves Revenge for Our Parents.
Yep, I got it. They're sending them over to our payroll, and we're getting them sent.
But no less tragic. They issued a leaflet arguing against the mass arrest of so many loyal citizens.
Oh, it should just go to your card.
Of course, virtually all arrested
Yeah,
themselves.
yeah. If not, it's what stinks is because they've already sent yours for last week now too. So I'm having to make sure our payroll understands that, hey, these other hours are what he should have gotten Friday, and then don't hold it until Friday. But I hope they don't do it too. But I'm sorry that it's turned into this night. It shouldn't happen like this. Normally we don't have any issues getting payroll set from them.
Simply calling attention to the needs of such a child could easily be taken as criticism of the government. Sure,
Oh yeah, yeah,
we would let
yeah.
young people suffer.
Yeah, it's and then plus, yeah, we accidentally put the wrong dates on it, and she's like, "Well, I gave you the hours." I'm like, "Well, no, you didn't because you had the wrong dates on it. You were holding it." All right, so yeah, believe me, I'm gonna reach out to you as soon as my payroll says something. Okay. Yep. Poor guy.
Was done at great risk after the assistant chief of Red Army
All right.
Intelligence and his wife were executed. Their apartment had been seized by the government. Their 13-year-old daughter had nowhere to go and was taken in by a family whose daughter was a close friend of hers. Concerned, the foster father went to the head of the NKVD secretary for advice as to how to best handle the situation. After agreeing that the matter is a very delicate one, the secretary gave his thoughts. At any rate, he said, it isn't proper for you to keep her. My advice to you is try to get rid of her. The father, of course, did as he was advised. The fate of such young girls put out into the street can be imagined, but perhaps shouldn't be. Those children who were a little older joined gangs and were often thereby arrested for genuine, if perhaps unavoidable, criminal behavior. Soviet prison survivor Gustav Herling-Brzezinski discussed their lifestyle in his memoir. Juvenile delinquents, like the boys in the cell, are the plague of the Soviet prisons. Unnaturally excited, always ferreting in other men's bunks and inside their own trousers, they give themselves up passionately to the only two occupations of their lives, theft and self-abuse. Almost all of them either have no parents or else know nothing of their whereabouts. Throughout the vast expanse of the Russian police state, they managed to lead with astounding ease the typical life of the Bespedozny, the homeless, jumping goods trains, constantly on the move from town to town, from settlement to settlement. They make a living by stealing and selling goods from government stores, and frequently they steal back what they have just sold, blackmailing unsuspecting purchasers with the threat of laying information against them. They sleep in railway stations, in municipal parks, in tram terminuses. Often all their belongings can be wrapped in a small bundle tied with a leather strap. The easiest situations perhaps for those of the young people called upon to distance themselves from their ancestors and thereby the social class into which they had been born. In order to cast off the circumstances of their birth, explained one Western reporter, it became commonplace for young people to publicly denounce their families and thereby repudiate their bourgeois origins. This is often done with said parents' consent or even at their recommendation.
Okay.
To see these sorts of notices in the press was jarring to the outside world, and with good reason. But even betraying one's own was not enough. In the perverted Soviet system, people who turned in family members were still in a sense connected in perpetuity to those undesirable elements. Fitzpatrick recounts the incident of one communist who informed of his mother-in-law before himself being accused of being related to her. The more antithetical to communist ideology one's ostensible status was, the greater the coup it became to get them to publicly turn against their own. As powerful of a statement as it might be to turn on one's parents,
let me make sure this is on the way for
turn
you
on one's
too.
God. It was Karl Marx himself who famously wrote that religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, that religion was a deceit, and that he no longer wanted to be a weapon in the hands of counter-revolutionaries. He then ripped off his vestments and left the church. This was a new society of the future. Instead of God, there was only man, and that man was Joseph Stalin. Chapter 7. Afraid of anything and everybody. The year 1933 saw Adolf Hitler come to power in an economically devastated Germany. By that point, Benito Mussolini had been in office in Italy for a decade, and the following year would see Broadway singing his praises. You're the top, you're Harry Houdini. You're the top, you're Mussolini. At the time, Mussolini was regarded as somewhat of a moderate, a fusionist who combined the best elements of socialist Russia and capitalist America to create the third way of fascism. Talk of American Revolution had been in the air since the days of Louis Ling, and this buzz sharply escalated. As newspapers dutifully reported that the Soviet Union was surviving its birthing pains, the Great Depression seemed to prove Marx's predictions of the internal self-contradictions of capitalism correct. It seemed only a matter of time before his other prediction, that of a revolution by the working class, would come true as well. Early in 1932, over 10,000 veterans of the Great War had camped out in Washington, D.C., living in shanties that they had assembled from random junk. Destitute, they demanded that the bonuses due to them in 1945 be made redeemable now. That July, they were ordered to clear out by the police. They rioted instead, and 2 vets ended up getting killed. President Hoover now had 10,000 ex-military men on his front stoop. Things were escalating into a crisis completely out of the president's control, seemingly par for the course for his administration. Hoover sent in troops to clear out the veterans that same day. Backed up by Majors George S. Patton and Dwight Eisenhower, General Douglas MacArthur led a military contingent and carried out Hoover's orders successfully, with the idea of literally
Well, you will when you do
attacks against
some of
hungry
the
American
application
veterans was a
forms, yeah.
complete public relations disaster.
I don't know why I
Throughout the
moved over
1932
here and it
presidential
just
race,
popped up
FDR
on-
successfully
Oh, you finally got it?
President Hoover for indifference to the ongoing depression.
I don't know if it'll let you once you
First
start.
massive spending hikes, which he would manage out
I mean,
several times
yeah.
over when he became president himself.
Hang on a second. Let me
The campaign against
reset
Hoover
his
got so
password
bad
first.
that the president received a telegram from some
And then
smart
we'll have to
aleck
see
advising him
where
to
you're at on
vote for
there just to.
Roosevelt and make it
No, I just
unanimous.
started.
Though the
It
vote that
says,
November was not quite
started.
unanimous, the
Okay.
1932
Well,
election
okay.
was still as drastic a reversal
I mean, it's up to you.
as could be expected.
That's fine. That's fine.
1928, Hoover had taken 40 states, and now
All
FDR
right,
stacked
try it again.
42,
Temp 1, 2, 3
dropping
is
Hoover's
finished.
percentage of the popular vote from a landslide 58% to a mere 40%. The Senate elections were a similar bloodbath, with FDR's Democrats winning 28 out of 34 races and defeating Republican leader James Watson in the process. The Democrats picked up almost 100 seats in the House of Representatives, giving them a lead of close to 3-1 and a record number of seats. FDR's first 100 days in the White House were a massive leftward tilt in American governance, with the machinery of government moving at an unprecedented pace. Everything seemed to be on the table in terms of policy. It was very clear that this was a historic opportunity
Mondays.
to remake the relationship between the private sphere and the public one. These were unprecedented times, and one lifelong leftist was inspired to try and do something about it. Upton Sinclair remains the classic example of
Mostly.
those journalist activists then known as muckrakers, a more polite way of saying shit stirrers. His novel The Jungle is still assigned in high school classes over a century after its publication. Decades before his book, The
Hey Nick,
Expression,
are you
sausages
having any
and
issues when
tobacco
you're
seed
trying to
being
reset
made was
someone's
immediate based on the
password?
less than
Then
pleasant
it'll
culinary
log in. It
process.
just takes
It
them to a
was
page where it
Sinclair who
says,
showed Americans
click
how
on
the
this link, but there's
sausage
no
literally
link.
got made. Ostensibly fiction, The Jungle claimed to portray, among other things, the unsanitary conditions in meatpacking factories. The apex of Sinclair's gruesome prose
Yeah, I'm
came
trying to
when
get this
the
guy
workers were
ready
back
for
and record
Synchron
large for sale to the
interview,
general
and
public. They couldn't believe it
we
stopped
can't even
butter.
get him
After being
logged in.
serialized in a
Won't-
socialist newspaper
I did a
year
reset
prior,
and
The
everything.
Jungle
He's
was
typing
first
in the right
published
thing.
in
I'm
book
watching
form
him do it, and then
February
it's taking him to a
1906.
page that says, click
President
on the
Teddy
link
Roosevelt
below,
had
and
been
there's
a
no
harsh
link.
skeptic of the young Sinclair, but the novel worked its magic on the president as it did on so many others. By
0812.
June 30, Roosevelt was signing into law the Federal Meat
Well, I
Inspection
mean,
Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, creating what would
no, I mean, it's
eventually become
reset.
today's
It's taking the
enormously
temporary
influential Food and Drug
password. It's just
Administration,
once he
FDA.
clicks on to
Sinclair was
enter
only
after
27 years
it
old.
accepts it,
Already his writing
it
was
says,
changing
please
the
click
face
on
of
this link.
America. He was an influencer
And
over a century
there's no
before the
link.
term achieved its contemporary connotations. Sinclair's stated purpose in writing The
All right,
Jungle had been to
let me
spread
see if
the
I can do it
message of
from here.
socialism to the
Thanks.
American
All right,
people.
bye.
Instead, the federal government became a guarantor of the quality of products of
second.
private
Let me
industry
see.
at public cost. Rather than the state operating the factories, the capitalists continued to produce their meat unabated. Despite the author's best efforts, his book did not whet the population's appetite for a socialist takeover of the meat industry. As Sinclair put it, I aimed at the public's heart.
Let me see if
and
it's
by
just that
accident I hit
browser,
the
Mario.
stomach.
Just give me a
To this
second.
day, largely due to Sinclair, it is regarded as an uncontroversial truth that the government is the best and only agency with the capacity to certify the safety of food. The alternative would obviously be mass death and illness.
Yeah, it's
Like
that
virtually
browser.
all other socialists at the time, Sinclair was somewhat critical of, but not entirely
I'm
opposed
just
to,
gonna make it the same
communism.
thing again
Hungry
for
for
now.
political power and
We
eager to
can
spread
change
his
it later if we
ideology,
want to.
Sinclair ran for the House of Representatives in 1920 and for the United States Senate in 1922 under the banner of the Socialist Party. When both those failed, he tried to run for California governor in 1926 and again in 1930, earning roughly 4% of the vote each time. But all that was before FDR's landslide. 50% of the people are going to vote a certain ticket because their grandfather voted that ticket, Sinclair realized. In order to get anywhere, it is necessary to have a party which has grandfathers. The author-activist accordingly tossed his hat to the ring as a Democrat for the 1934 California gubernatorial election. Despite having no political experience and no affiliation with the Democratic Party for decades, Sinclair easily clinched the nomination. All that stood between him and the governor's office was hapless Republican Governor Frank Merriam, who had only assumed office in June upon the death of his predecessor. Sinclair's plan for California was bold and it was radical. His promise to end poverty in California, EPIC, was based on
do the
two
employee
principles,
login
namely
this time.
private ownership of tools, a basis of freedom when tools are simple, becomes a basis of enslavement when tools are complex. complex. Autocracy in industry cannot exist alongside democracy and government. The existence of luxury in the presence of poverty and destitution is contrary to good morals and sound public policy. The present depression is one of abundance, not scarcity. The cause of the trouble is that a small class has the wealth while the rest have the debts. The remedy is to give the workers access to the
I don't know
means
why
of
that
production
browser's
and let
acting
them
so
produce
weird.
for themselves, not for others. In short, the largest part of his epic plan was for the government to take over idle lands or factories and put the unemployed to work on them. Reporters had some very obvious questions for Sinclair, namely, suppose your plan goes into effect, won't it cause a great many
No, that's if we ever
unemployed
change it. We will change it to that, so you can change it back to whatever you want. You can change. You can make it pass for whatever you want. Something you'll remember.
If I'm elected, half the unemployed of the United States will come to California, and he'll have to make plans to take care of them. I went on to discuss this subject. Of course, I said I was making Mr. Hopkins a sales talk, but he recognized the situation. The unemployed come to California every fall because it is less easy to freeze to death here. The federal government is taking care of them where they are, and it will have to take care of them in California. Mr. Hopkins knows that. Someone asked if there was any way they could be kept out of California, and I said the only way was to keep the people of California so poor that those in other states would not envy their condition. In fact, they have to be kept a little poorer because California is a pleasanter place to live in. Such was the program actually favored by our big business masters, I added. Now the question became whether FDR would endorse Sinclair and his leftist ideas, or if he would try and remain out of the fray. A Democrat hadn't been elected California governor in 40 years, but FDR had carried the state 58% to 38% over Hoover 4 years after Hoover had won it 65% to 34%. Clearly, the possibility of a Governor Sinclair was very real. After vacillating for a while, FDR finally agreed to meet with Sinclair. On September 4, 1934, Sinclair made his way to the president's upstate New York estate at Hyde Park for a conversation that, by all accounts, was highly amiable. In his typical reptilian fashion, FDR made sure that Sinclair left the meeting with the belief that the president agreed with him and would come out publicly against the very concept of profit. Roosevelt told Sinclair that he intended to give a speech on or around October 25th, right before the election, advocating Sinclair's preferred production for use as against production for profit. If you will do that, Mr. President, Sinclair said, it will elect me. FDR, of course, intended nothing of the kind. It only took him 5 days before he was throwing Sinclair under the bus, but doing so off the record to reporters so that the gubernatorial candidate was none the wiser. Not only calling the scale of Sinclair's epic plan utterly impossible, FDR went on to paint Sinclair as a fanatic. If Sinclair has any sense in him, the president said, he will modify, at least in practice, this perfectly wild-eyed scheme of his and carry it on as a community experiment. It was on October 24th, not the 25th, that Roosevelt did in fact give a speech. He told a group of bankers that America has what we call and accept as a profit system. Rather than endorsing Sinclair's socialist vision, Roosevelt reiterated his view of free enterprise as the basis of the American economy. On election day a couple weeks later, Democrats won 25 out of 34 gubernatorial races. 2 others were won by third-party candidates, and just 7 won by Republicans, including California. The progressive candidate in the election won 13% of the vote in a race that Democratic nominee Upton Sinclair lost by 11%. Sinclair did not take it well and later claimed that his supporters were even more devastated. Men and women broke down and wept when the certainty of our defeat became apparent. I know of women who cried the whole night through, and doubtless there were thousands. I know of 1 suicide and at least 1 other attempt. Epic continued as a movement, and Roosevelt shamelessly adopted some of Sinclair's ideas as he further built up the New Deal in his attempts to battle America's ongoing Great Depression. 4 years later, Sinclair engaged in a public exchange of letters with the aforementioned journalist Eugene Lyons. Lyons had been a young communist sent to Russia under the auspices of the United Press in hopes that his ideological sympathy with the Bolsheviks would earn him greater access. The gamble paid off. At only 32 years of age and 3 years before Walter Duranty, Lyons became the first Western journalist to interview Stalin. This increased access also meant increased information, and just as with Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, Lyons became a harsh critic of the USSR after seeing with his own eyes what the Bolshevik experiment meant in practice. The debate between Sinclair and Lyons was a perfect stand-in for the broader cultural debate in the West as to what one's relationship to the Soviet Union should be, especially in the face of increasing German belligerence. Yes, Sinclair was a socialist, but
I may have to update the browser for that computer
I
because
have been
everything else
tireless
is
in my
working.
insistence upon majority consent, he wrote, and in my rejection of every suggestion of violence and dictatorship in bringing about social change. A champion of the working men, he resented being accused of things he did not identify as in the slightest. Having been a socialist for 32 years and having set forth my ideas in a score of books and hundreds of magazine articles, I really thought I was safe from being called a communist. At the same time, he made clear that when I criticize what Russia is doing, I criticize it as a friend who understands. The exchange exchange of letters between Lyons and Sinclair was collected under the title Terror in Russia. The question mark was no doubt Sinclair's, as Lyons knew for a fact what was happening in the Soviet Union. To his dubious credit, Sinclair did not shy away from acknowledging and justifying Stalin's brutality. I read not long ago of an American diplomat who had traveled over Europe, including Russia. He said, "It is a fact that the Russians have never learned to govern without killing." That was an unkind saying, but if it is true, it is something we have to take account of. We do not kill our political opponents, at least not often, but in Russia, it is a custom of long standing. There's something uniquely bizarre about hearing Upton Sinclair, one of the most popular and influential radicals in American history, rationalizing mass murder on the basis of tradition. In words that would sound chilling within a decade, Sinclair's view of the mass Ukrainian starvation was that, "I venture to doubt that 5 million were permitted to die." Permitted is one of those words that have different meanings. At the very least, Sinclair was claiming that the Soviet government wouldn't allow such a thing to happen without acting to prevent it. That Stalin was in fact responsible for those deaths didn't even enter Sinclair's thought as a consideration. "My guess," Sinclair continued, "is that it is nearer to 1 million, but that was enough." What basis Sinclair had for this admitted guess, he never says. But what's a few million lives here or there? The system of socialized industry and collectivized agriculture, Sinclair summed up, is one which has proved so disturbingly successful in the Soviet Union. He was right. The elements of Stalin's collectivized agriculture which were most successful, the unremitting demand for grain which starved millions, were also the most disturbing. Again and again, Sinclair excused away any and all aspects of mass coercion. The Russians did it by force because that is the only way that anything has ever been done in Russia. The principle of the revolution was to create a new society, as Sinclair knew well. But once again, a tradition of violence was an explanation, if not a downright excuse. Then Sinclair made quite a bold prediction. Unless the fascists succeed in defeating the Soviet Union in the war they are planning and taking away the Ukraine and other grain-producing land, no more people need die of hunger in the Soviet Union. At least that is my belief. The 1 million or 5 million lives which were sacrificed will mean the savings of hundreds of millions of lives in future times. In this, Sinclair was technically correct. Once Stalin's government ran out of people that he wanted to starve, he in fact stopped starving them. But what was even more disturbing was the hand-waving away of millions of real flesh and blood people for the sake of some imaginary future hypothetical. There has never been in human history a great social change without killing, Sinclair dishonestly claimed. Our Civil War cost 1 million lives and $5 billion. If anyone argues that Lincoln and Grant were mass murderers, the only way you could answer is to point out the gains in the preservation of the Union and the ending of chattel slavery. The comparison between lives lost in warfare and lives lost due to oppression by the government seemed to be lost on Sinclair, as is the fact that the Civil War led to freeing the enslaved, while Stalin had done everything in his power to crush the Ukrainian population. At the very least, there was the tacit admission that there had been a war waged against the farmers, who were supposedly the same people Sinclair had championed his entire life. The man who saw firsthand how duplicitous politicians could be had no qualm about taking Stalin's propaganda at face value. For Sinclair and many others of his stripe, the enormously lagging economy, no one was ending poverty in Russia anytime soon, was all the fault of wreckers who deserved whatever they got. Despite its decades-old secret police, the Soviet Union was somehow overrun with both Nazi and Japanese agents. According to Sinclair, questioning Stalin's claims wasn't an exercise in prudence so much as one in absurdity. That Germany and Poland, Romania and Japan have been filling the Soviet Union with spies and provocateurs is something which no sensible person would doubt for a moment, he proclaimed. If such persons were sent into this country and committed wholesale wrecking of machinery and destruction of human life, we would shoot them, and no doubt other nations which were getting ready to make war on us would denounce it as a terrible and barbarous action. Those who questioned Stalin's executions were the ones acting in bad faith and simply trying to weaken Soviet power. After all, Americans also shoot people who break machinery. Sinclair also regarded as absurd the concept that the Russian people faced heavy literary censorship. Replying to Lyons, he wrote, "You doubt the benefits of Soviet education, saying that only words written by the ruling clique may be read. Will you really defend such a statement, or is it merely a bit of rhetoric? And how did Sinclair know that Russian citizens had access to whatever they would like to read? He knew because more than 3 million of my books have been translated and published in Russia." Sinclair could not disprove that there was complete government control of political discourse within the USSR, so he instead just sort of denied it. In response to the accusation that all these persons are entirely enslaved, he simply declared that, "I'm unable to believe this, and I think that if the ruling group in Russia has committed a betrayal of basic principles of socialism, workers' democracy, the educated workers will find it out in the course of time and will find a way to get that which has been so elaborately planned to them for the past 20 years. How they would find such things out and how they would learn such things from a state which starved millions of its own citizens, Sinclair didn't even bother to hypothesize." Finally, Sinclair defended the mass executions of Stalin's political political opponents, or rather those who were alleged to have been his opponents. As to the left-wing extremists who have been trying to hamper Stalin by sabotage and underground civil war, I've been shocked and cried by their fate, but there was always a but. Sinclair ignored that sabotage and underground civil war in the Soviet Union had come to be defined simply as disagreeing with Stalin, insisting that when they started the war on Stalin, they did so at their own risk and perfectly well knowing it. If the medicine they had to swallow is bitter, the answer is that it is their own medicine, which they have been brewing and administering throughout their political careers. Once again, drawing parallels between Stalin and the Founding Fathers, both were revolutionaries after all, Sinclair points out that we hanged Major Andre, and you could hardly doubt that we should have hanged Benedict Arnold if we had been able to catch him. In regard to the obviously phony trials, Sinclair claimed to have taken a balanced view. Over and over I asked myself, is it conceivable that revolutionists trained in a lifetime of war against the Tsar would go into open court and confess to actions which they had not committed? I asked, is there any torture, any kind of terror, physical, mental, or moral, which would induce them to such a thing? Rhetorical questions are perhaps of use rhetorically, but they do not affect reality in the slightest. If an individual cannot conceive of an answer to a question, that does not mean or even imply that the answer is inconceivable. It could simply mean that his knowledge or imagination is limited. The man who wrote of greedy capitalists selling sausages made of human meat found it impossible that men, even men trained in a lifetime of war, could be tortured to such a degree that they would make false confessions, even if they were confessing to things which were demonstrably false and literally impossible. The greater the atrocity, the more people would like to believe, or possibly even need to believe, that the reports were surely an exaggeration. It would clearly be preferable if none of Stalin's innocent victims had been tortured. If denial was not an option, then bargaining comes in. Let's haggle and hope for half the number claimed, and that the tortures that were alleged were exaggerated in the manner of some trashy story in a forgotten pulp magazine. The Stalin epic is replete with what appear as improbabilities to minds unfitted to deal with the phenomena of conquest. Similarly with the argument that Stalin could not have killed millions of peasants, since that would have been economically counterproductive. It was akin to the enormous skepticism in the West regarding early reports about Nazi atrocities. It was almost impossible to conceive of such extremes of evil, and to multiply it on the scale necessary to process the information.
If you just leave it blank, or just put zeros if you don't know them, you don't have to
All there is to know about Adolf Eichmann.
put NA in any spot that they say needs to be filled out. Just put NA in it. I'm not worried about it.
Oversized incisors, green saliva. Writing in 1994, communist writer Eugene Genovese explained the thinking thus. About 20 years ago, picking up on some passages in Roy Medvedev's 1971 book, Let History Judge, I wondered if Comrade Stalin had not killed more communists and were killed by all the bourgeois, imperialist, fascist, and Nazi regimes put together. It can't be true, said I. Has Comrade Medvedev taken up serious drinking? So I sat down to do some rough arithmetic. You do not have to be good at math to do that much arithmetic. Alas, Comrade Medvedev had not taken up serious drinking. Contemptuous of the idea that Stalin's government is no better than those of Mussolini or Hitler, Sinclair made clear the distinction. I have read Mussolini's speeches and know that he is one of those imperialist conquerors who care so little about truth and consistency that they can argue that their growing population must have more land to expand to, and at the same time can adopt measures to turn the women of their country into brood mares to raise more future soldiers in order that their country may be able to expand. This was in contrast to Stalin, who cared a great deal about truth and consistency and never dared dream of imperialistic conquest. Having watched the international policy of the Soviet Union from day to day as it has developed, Sinclair went on, I say that its record is pretty nearly perfect, and that upon that record it is entitled to the trust of every friend of democracy and peace. Sneering at the idea that Stalin and Hitler could ever work together, Sinclair chose to go with sarcasm. I would have thought that the shooting of Tukhachevsky and other pro-German generals might be taken to have settled that question for a long time, but to admit that would be to attribute something good to Stalin, the author said, frustrated that Stalin wasn't getting credit for all the good that he had done. The Tukhachevsky and the other generals had been tortured to confess to working with Hitler. By 1957, he and his executed colleagues would be acquitted by the Soviet Union of all charges and politically rehabilitated. Sinclair's sign off to the whole affair did not age well, to put it mildly. I give you one simple method, as certain as litmus paper in a test tube, to determine whether the Soviet Union has now become counter-revolutionary. When Hitler learns that the Soviet Union has become counter-revolutionary, he will reduce the ardor of his crusade against it. When that happens, I will admit that Stalin has sold out the workers. Sinclair was hardly alone. When he, on August 14, 1939, a group of self-described 400 leading Americans penned an open letter calling for greater unity unity of the anti-fascist forces and strengthening the front against aggression through closer cooperation with the Soviet Union. It doesn't take much to make the argument that an alliance with Stalin was the right move for the United States to make after the 1941 Pearl Harbor attacks. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Yet 2 years before the Japanese assault on Hawaii, there was already a great amount of agitation for the United States to work closely with Stalin. Not in the sense of holding one's breath, but in the sense that this would be an unmitigated good. The traditional strongest argument for Americans to ally with Stalin, that Hitler was a unique evil, wasn't invoked. Not only was there no reference to Hitler's crimes, there was no argument to be made that if Hitler wasn't stopped, then millions would be killed, if that were even preventable to begin with.
Or I could just print them out for you real quick.
Wasn't even mentioned by the leading Americans at all. Their only
I am, but
anti-Semitism was to insist that the Soviet Union
busy just makes the day go by fast.
anti-Semitism or any racial animosity a criminal offense. In other words, these self-described leaders were boasting about the criminalization of speech in the USSR. On the domestic scene, the reactionaries have encouraged the fantastic falsehood that the USSR and the totalitarian states are basically alike. They said the signatories were troubled by a recent manifesto issued by the so-called Committee for Cultural Freedom. This was the official name of the Dewey Committee, which had investigated the charges against Trotsky and all the others put on trial by Stalin and his men. The committee had concluded that it is impossible for any honest person, on the basis of records so full of contradictions and deliberate falsifications as the records of both trials, to come to any conclusion concerning their guilt or innocence of other charges or the nature of their crimes, if any. While we prefer to dwell on facts rather than personalities, the leading Americans claimed, we feel it is necessary to point out that among the signers of this manifesto are individuals who have for years had as their chief political objective the maligning of the Soviet people and their government, and it is precisely these people who are the initiators and controllers of the committee. We can't tell if Trotsky had meetings in hotels that no longer existed because the people asking questions had a history of the maligning of the Soviet people. The letter then offered 10 points how Soviet socialism differed from fascism. First and foremost was the claim that the USSR continues as always to be a consistent bulwark against war and aggression and works unceasingly for the goal of a peaceful international order. The Soviet Union has emancipated women in the family, they insisted, and has developed an advanced system of childcare.
At Vectrum, it's usually 5 a.m. to 3:30 p.m.
Brazenly, they went on to claim that the best literature from Homer to Thomas Mann,
And then the second shift is 3:30 p.m. to 2 a.m.
is available to the
at
masses
Vectrum
of the
anyway.
Soviet people in a country where reading the wrong book was grounds for imprisonment and extermination. The USSR had taken part in extending scientific procedures to every field, from economics to public health, not mentioning
This is just
those
first
Russian
shift here.
people
They only
were
do
being
first shift here.
experimented upon. The ninth point might be the most
And that's when they do bring people on here. It's, like I said, it's pretty rare. But yeah, it's sometimes they do a Monday through Friday 7 to 3:30, depending on the position. But for the mixed plant itself, it's a 10-hour position. It's the 5 to 3:30. But yeah, if they ever do the quality or anything like that, that's usually 7 to 3:30.
To material security and sickness and old age, to equality of the sexes in all fields of activity, and to equality of all races and nationalities. The cast of signatories might seem oddly contemporary, especially in terms of informing, or perhaps simply forming American political opinion.
Well, they took away the attendance penalty. They're just paying you. Yeah. Yeah, they took it away. There's no penalty anymore if you miss anything.
Because I know dance does that. Industrial engineering, sociology, and of zoology.
We do it with some of our. It all depends on the client. Yeah. Yeah, well, Advance is still doing the penalty too.
Yeah, I heard about that. Those guys would always be like, oh, talking about from Yale University Divinity School. The poets William Carlos Williams and Langston Hughes appear
We negotiated that out of our last deal with them.
as well as one of its
So it was
professors
silly.
of mathematics. James Thurber, Dorothy Parker's partner in Snide and staff writer from the New Yorker, makes an appearance. Williams College has 2 professors of government, with Vassar offering a German professor, the University of California a professor of Slavic languages, and a professor of Russian language and institutions, and economics professors from the University of Chicago.
Been sitting all weekend, so it's warming up before it shoots that out.
Hunter, Columbia, NYU, and Colgate round out the list. Finally, there were editors from both The Nation and The New Republic, a ballet producer, several artists, as well as Dashiell Hammett, Granville Hicks, again, and Ernest Hemingway. It was the role of these men and women to promote ideas to the American people. As creators of public opinion, they had the power to declare an ideology as being mainstream and desirable. Indeed, they were the ones who defined what mainstream desirable discourse consisted of. The theory of the marketplace of ideas was often unable to compete with the reality of a monopoly of ideology, especially in an era where the flow of information was far more tightly controlled and technologically limited. Arendt had thoughts on how those who were partial to Stalinism operated. The sympathizers, who are to all appearances still innocuous fellow citizens in a non-totalitarian society, can hardly be called single-minded fanatics. Through them, the movements make their fantastic lies more generally acceptable, can spread their propaganda in
Where you at?
milder, more respectable
Who needs
forms,
help?
until the whole atmosphere is poisoned.
Glad to help you if you're
Totalitarian
stuck
elements
in.
which
You
are
done?
hardly recognizable
Okay,
as such,
let me
but
pull you up
appear
in
to
the
be
system real
normal
quick.
political reactions or opinions. The fellow traveler organizations surround the totalitarian movements with a mist of normality and respectability that fools the membership about the true character of the outside world as much as it does the outside world about the true character of the movement. Days after the letter was published, Hitler not only reduced the ardor of his crusade against the Soviet Union, but signed a non-aggression pact with Stalin. One may accept or reject the ideology of Hitlerism as well as any other ideological system. That is a matter of taste. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov decreed soon after. News of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact shook the world, and knowing he had nothing to fear from Stalin gave Hitler the freedom to invade Poland. Stalin likewise invaded from the east a little over 2 weeks later. American organizations that had advocated for involvement in Europe to fight fascism changed their names and
What's up, bud?
slogans literally overnight to
Will you be there today, right?
and not
You gonna be okay?
For
Okay.
many on the left, aligning with Hitler was a bridge too far, and they permanently turned their backs on their infatuation with Stalin. As for Upton Sinclair, he never did end up admitting that Stalin had sold out the workers. Chapter 8. In constant terror from morning until night. FDR was the first president to have his policy publicly guided by intellectuals instead of mostly politicians or other prominent citizens. His brain trust was taken from the faculties of Harvard Law and Columbia, and the term trust meant monopoly implied that all the great minds of the day were concentrated in his White House. As such, FDR was unusually attuned to what the creators of public opinion were saying at any given time, and he needed all the brain power he could get. As the 1930s drew to a close, the Great Depression plodded on with no end in sight. Clearly, capitalism wasn't working, and even the New Deal wasn't new enough for many leading thinkers of the day. Unemployment was at 19% in December of 1938, somewhat better than the 23.6% it had been when FDR was elected in 1932, but still nowhere near a palatable number. Worse, economic growth in 1938 had been negative for the first time in 5 years, shrinking at 3.3%. In many ways, the year 1940 was an unprecedented one in American politics, largely because FDR intended to seek a third term. No president had been elected or even nominated to a third term before, despite several attempts by some to hold on to power. Even a stroke-ridden Woodrow Wilson had to be told by his own party that his services would no longer be required in 1920. Prior to 1940, it basically went up to the party conventions to choose the vice presidential nominee. This resulted in some truly odd pairings, such as conservative President William McKinley being matched with vigorous upstart Teddy Roosevelt in 1900. In 1932, FDR had Speaker of the House John Cactus Jack Garner foisted upon him at the convention. The prickly Texan did not at all consider himself a subordinate to the president, being instrumental in helping engineer the defeat of FDR's 1937 court packing scheme, the first major political defeat that the president had faced. By 1940, Garner had enough and declared himself a candidate for the presidency before FDR made any declaration about seeking a third term. When FDR decided that he himself was the only man for the job, once again, having Garner on the 1940 ticket became a non-starter, as was the idea that choosing his running mate should be left up to the whims of the party. This is no ordinary time, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt told the convention. Her coded words did much to allow the attendees to see their historic role and give FDR the man whom he had handpicked as his running mate. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Aggard Wallace, a former hardcore Republican turned strong New Deal advocate. Wallace was not an entirely easy person to put over, even by FDR to his own convention. A new ager before the term existed, DNC Chairman Jim Farley worried that people look on him as a mystic. What Farley was referring to was Wallace's fairly well-known interest in Eastern faiths like Buddhism and Zoroastrianism. More politically dangerous was what became known as the Dear Guru letters that Wallace had exchanged with Russian theosophist Nicholas Roerich, who was seen as a sort of neo-Rasputin with hypnotic sway. FDR insisted Wallace was not a mystic, but instead a philosopher, a liberal philosopher. And while there was some pushback among Democrats, President Roosevelt's hold over the party was enormous. I won't deliver that acceptance speech until we see whom they nominate, he threatened to party insiders. That was pretty much enough to put Wallace over the top. He was nominated on the first ballot despite the discomfort of many Democrats. The 1940 GOP nominee was businessman Wendell Willkie, who had no previous political experience and who strongly shared FDR's vision of a firmly internationalist United States ensuring a fair and just world for peoples all over the globe. It naturally followed that Willkie's first book would be entitled One World. The Roosevelt-Wallace ticket was handily elected over Wilkie, 449 electoral votes to 82. A year after the election came Pearl Harbor, the first foreign assault on U.S. soil since 1812. America was now solidly and firmly involved in World War II. The vice presidency is historically a thankless political position. Woodrow Wilson's vice president Thomas Marshall was known for his wisecracks and had quipped in 1912 that once there were two brothers, one ran away to sea, the other was elected vice president, and nothing was heard of either of them again. There is something to be said for the fact that Marshall's joke is far better known today than he himself is. Henry Wallace's tenure as vice president was largely uneventful for the bulk of his term. It was still very much FDR's White House, and after Pearl Harbor, the vice president's role became even more diminished than usual. It was only by 1944, the year Roosevelt would seek a fourth term, that Henry Wallace made major waves when he authored a pamphlet entitled Our Job in the Pacific. The contents would largely become a big deal due to one of the vilest people who had ever lived, Roald Dahl. Dahl's name survives as one of the most widely read and respected children's book authors of all time, with classic after classic to his credit, like James and the Giant Peach and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. A giant of a man, the 6'5" or 6'6", accounts differ, Britt was quite vocal throughout his life about his racist and anti-Semitic views. Claims that Hitler didn't just pick on them for no reason paled in comparison to his personal behavior. Dahl would eventually end up marrying actress Patricia Neal, who had played the romantic interest and off-screen lover, to star Gary Cooper in the film adaptation of Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead. The movie's sexual tension had culminated in Neal's rape by engraved invitation by Cooper. Dahl acted similarly after his wife suffered a series of 3 strokes in rapid succession, temporarily putting her into a coma and causing newspapers to prematurely run her obituary. Her recovery process was nightmarish. We were sleeping together, but sex hadn't entered my mind. So when his hand touched me, I was stunned. I did not tell him he couldn't do that, but I hoped he would hear my silent signal. Half my body was paralyzed and the other half rigid with tension. I closed my eyes and did not move. I did not scream. I wanted to. It was agony. Agony. In 1944, however, Dahl's greatest claim to fame was having been shot down and badly burned during a Royal Air Force pilot mission over Greece. He was also a British Secret Service agent assigned to Washington, and it was in that capacity that he uncovered information that would help to torpedo Wallace's career. As Wallace biographer John C. Culver recounts, Dahl attended a social gathering at the Washington home of the Texas newspaper publisher Charles Marsh. There, he saw Marsh and Wallace reviewing the manuscript of Our Job in the Pacific. After Wallace left, Marsh showed the manuscript to Dahl. The agent took the manuscript downstairs where he said he could read it in privacy. Instead, he called a contact at British Security Coordination and told him to come quickly to Marsh's house. I handed the draft through the car window and told him he must be back within 15 minutes, Dahl recalled. The man buzzed off to the BSC Washington offices and duly returned the manuscript to me on the dot. In the pamphlet, Wallace advocated the decolonization of East Asia, something entirely at odds with the British perspective at the time, especially the perspective of Prime Minister Winston Churchill. You know, Churchill is likely to ask the president to get a new vice president, Dahl correctly predicted. Churchill blew his top, and though the relationship between him and FDR was a complex and often difficult one, there's a little doubt the British animus toward Wallace affected the president's perspective. The Brits were not alone. After 4 years in office, Wallace had acquired a reputation of being too cozy with the radical left. Though clearly an ideological progressive, many Democrats remembered that Wallace had been a loyal Republican not that long ago, in a period where men like the Senators Lafayette represented the vibrant left-wing tradition within the GOP. These concerns were especially important for White House insiders who could see firsthand that President Roosevelt was on his last legs, making the question of his possible successor one of utmost importance. 3 things happened on July 11, 1944. First, FDR officially announced that he would be seeking a 4th term as president. Second, FDR decided to dump Wallace from the ticket. Third, he met with Wallace to strategize about the forthcoming campaign. Just as with Upton Sinclair, Wallace left the meeting certain that FDR would shortly be endorsing him. 10 days later, and with FDR's blessing, Democratic Party Chairman Robert Hannigan and other party insiders used all the power at their disposal to make sure that Henry Wallace was removed from the ticket and Senator Harry S. Truman nominated as the vice presidential candidate instead. The FDR-Truman ticket won another landslide, 36 out of the 48 states, while retaining 22 seats in the House after the 1942 midterms had reduced the Democrats' margin to a handful. 5 weeks after the inauguration, FDR was posing for an artist when he either declared, "I have a terrific pain in the back of my head," or "I have a terrific headache," before dying from a cerebral hemorrhage. Truman had been drinking with Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn when the call came for him to go to the White House.
My son's
immediately.
made some
There
too.
he met the First Lady and was told the news. Concerned, he asked Eleanor Roosevelt if there was anything he could do for her. "Is there anything we can do for you?" She replied, "You are the one in trouble now." A year after he would have been inaugurated as president, Henry Wallace published a book entitled Soviet Asia Mission about his trip abroad as vice president. In it, Wallace discussed touring Siberia and the Far East and his impression of the people and places that he saw. While FDR was administrating concentration camps for Japanese Americans at home, his vice president had been touring one in the Soviet Union and offering his approval of the conditions that the prisoners faced. There are very few loan words that English speakers have borrowed from the Russian language. Robot is often considered to be one of these, even though the origin is Czech. Bistro is another, the allegation being that Russian customers would yell, "Bistro, bistro," quickly, quickly, at French waitstaff in attempts to get them to hurry. But this seems to be more of a good story than good etymology. But there is one word in English whose Russian origin is not in dispute: gulag. The term's Russian origin is itself an acronym for Glavное управление лагерей, which translates to chief.
Yep, click where it says exit, and I'll bring you up in the system now.
The intellectual's mindset regarding Russian oppression quite succinctly. To a good many onlookers, the Russian Revolution is a great experiment in which sociological results to be attained justify a colossal human investment.
All right, so you are in the system. You are all set. As soon as anything opens, I'll reach out to you. What's your name again?
The application of pressure here and there as required by the
That's
research
okay.
experts, the exiling or physical extinction of
That's
a
okay.
portion of the population. It's all part of the experimental process. Those who are squeamish are just
Okay. Well, no, that's fine. Like I said, we do get openings here once in a while, so let me pull you up. So, and I'll. Marie Carroll got it.
But why should superior people be bothered about the noise? When you peer down from above, watching objectively, the Russians look quite small. French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre was not unique, though more explicit in his
Yeah, but the little parts where you get stuck and stuff, it makes it convenient to be here. That way I can tell you how to just jump past with, certain parts and stuff.
But I find equally intolerable the use made of
Hey, my
them every
name.
day in the bourgeois press. Theodore Dreiser was one of the great American novelists, still remembered for seminal works of naturalism such as Sister Carrie and Jenny Gerhardt. His sentiments in a 1933 missive mirrored Sartre's. I would answer your question about those Russian prisoners at once, except that I'm so much interested in the present difficulties in Russia and in Russia's general fate that I'm not prepared.
No, I got it. I got you pulled up.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to save your password or anything like that on there, you can. But I'm gonna get it pulled up. You're gonna log back in and let's try and do it on the computer though. Just click on employee login. Let me get it loaded for you though.
It is, as we say, just too bad. But after all, if by any process
No problem.
this or any other, Russia is
Have a
seriously
good day.
crippled or destroyed, what good would freeing those prisoners do? Yet, unlike Sartre or Dreiser or virtually all of the 400 leading Americans, Vice President Wallace had visited the Soviet Union personally, and not only did he visit,
Yeah,
he
this is the
toured
mixed blank here.
Siberian gulag town of Magadan himself. Over 40 million people have taken the place of the 7 million mostly
That's the
convicts
actual
who
production. That's where the
existed
packaging and
throughout
everything is
Russia.
done. Yeah.
Wallace explained. He compared the Siberian growth of population
You're
to
welcome.
how
No problem.
America after the Civil War developed her Wild West, pushing triumphantly to the Pacific and creating what Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Denver mean today. One might think that perhaps the climate and therefore livability in Los Angeles would in and of itself make the comparison to Siberian development a reach, but that was hardly the worst of it. Wallace credulous.
Do you have your
Russian
Fernando? Do you have your ID and stuff
12
with you?
years ago, the first
I'll go ahead and
settlers
scan
arrived
that
and put
too.
up 8
Let me get these
prefabricated
forms
houses.
loaded for you.
Today, Magadan has
So
40,000
were you
inhabitants
interested in
all
possibly
around.
Synchron in temperance, or were you just going to wait for a
Urban
position
growth in
here?
North Siberia is a proof that the climate is not an insuperable obstacle. Settlement in the Arctic, as
It's
if a
15
bunch
minutes
of
south of
adventurous
here. It's
families
not
had
that far.
decided to
It's
pack
near
up
the
and
border,
try
but
to
it's
make a claim
we're not that far
Siberia.
from
He
the
was
border
just
here.
blown away
So.
by these plucky Russians. The remarkable
They don't do
thing
food
is
production.
that
It's mostly
Siberia
automotive
growth
stuff,
is
tier
taking
one
place in advance of rail and
parts
border
that
road
they're pulling for
communications.
warranties and
Wallace
stuff
was
like
oblivious
that.
to the reality that virtually all of these trips to Siberia were both
But they're
one-way
busy.
and permanent. He made it a point to note that when
And
it came
they're
to
bringing
the
on
KGB,
folks right
everyone
now.
treated
So
them with great respect.
I'll let you
They
think
became
about it.
very
It's fine.
fond of their
We'll get
leader,
through this
while
the
boasting
basic
about how
paperwork
relatively
today,
well the shovel operators were
and
paid.
we'll
If
go
the
from
figures
there.
he repeats were incredible, Wallace neglected to mention that the nearby Karlak camp was a source of slave labor for the
It gets
gold
sketchy,
miners.
doesn't
A huge
it?
number of deportees were not even accused of any crimes, but were sent there simply due to their ethnicity, a constant issue in the heavily
Okay.
multi-ethnic Soviet Union. The people of Siberia today are a hardy, vigorous race, Wallace explained, but not because they are whipped into submission. The only whip driving them is the necessity to master a vast
Both.
land. And as
Yep,
of
I'll scan them
2020,
and then give them
farmers
right
are
back
still
to you.
uncovering dozens of bodies of people who had been executed by the NKVD. Wallace mused very enthusiastically about the literal song and dance performance that the Russians performed for him, gushing that, "I don't think I've ever seen anything better put on by the talent of a single city." It was actually not, as he characterized it, a concert by a non-professional Red Army choir.
Okay,
of Serb
go ahead and click on employee login.
One put on by prisoners. The conductor was a prisoner, the lead ballerina was a prisoner, and the choir was all prisoners. There were, in fact, almost no Red Army servicemen in Magadan. The captives had rehearsed all night and signed an oath to comport themselves as Soviet patriots. The two singers who had known English were shipped away, and when the vice president's show ended, the prisoner performers were loaded back into trucks and returned to the camp. Whatever the dramatic content of the show, the circumstances surrounding it can only be described as a farce. That the Soviets are definitely planning for a big increase of population in their eastern territory was for Wallace not a premonition of vast human suffering, but 20th century frontiersmanship, because Soviet Asia will see the rise of its own Pittsburghs, Clevelands, and Detroits. After all, there exists no other two countries more alike than the Soviet Union and the United States of America. He took time to both praise Marshal Stalin's wise leadership and to point out that Roosevelt instantly felt at home with Stalin. Wallace elsewhere asserted that the people of the United States should have been taught the truth about the Russian Revolution from the very start. That what said truth is and who was lying about the revolution he does not explain. There is nothing irreconcilable in our aims and purposes, Wallace concluded. Those who so proclaim are wittingly or unwittingly looking for war, and that, in my opinion, is criminal. How criticizing the Soviet system in general, or say denouncing slave labor camps, would be looking for war, Wallace chooses not to make clear, not to mention who he imagines would be waging war on whom. This claim of warmongering was a common tactic for the Henry Wallace of the world, as Orwell himself pointed out when Henry Wallace is asked by a newspaper interviewer why he issued falsified versions of his speeches to the press. He replies, "So you're one of those people who are clamoring for war with Russia?" Wallace was happy to accuse his political opponents of wanting war. Wars weren't the result of power-hungry political leaders, no. They were the result of inequality. War in our generation began in 1914 and has, in the main, continued in one form or another for more than 30 years, he asserted. When we dip deeply into the economic and scientific causes of these 30 years of terrible struggle, we find the outstanding factor to be the unequal growth of industrialization and the consequent unequal growth of population and political power among nations. The worst part, perhaps, was how Wallace breezily dismissed the millions of people starved by Stalin in Ukraine and elsewhere as merely a price to be paid for progress. Collective farming to Stalin was a method of making agriculture more productive, of getting the food surplus necessary to support urban workers. We in the United States may regard the methods employed as too costly in human terms, but there's no denying that it was a measure for integrating farm output with urban growth and a necessary measure of the industrialization plan, out of which came Karaganda and the other new Gulag towns, was to succeed. Part of Wallace's tour included information about a gold mine he was not told that it had led to over 16,000 deaths in 1942 alone. In fact, few of the people Wallace encountered were what they appeared or claimed to be. Being a politician, and a politician with a great deal of knowledge about farming and agriculture, Wallace made it a point to chat with as many ordinary people as he could. The bureaucrats who were pretending that they worked at the big farm were clueless about his questions regarding pig husbandry, but were saved by the quick work of the translators. Decades after Wallace's visit, the hidden history of the Gulag system has become better understood. Technically speaking, its
Yeah,
roots
log
lay
in.
in
Yep.
the Tsar's
Go and log in
control
with what
series
you
of
created.
prisons, which
That's-
housed so many of the
you remember what you made it?
before the revolution. That said, in 1916, there were fewer than
I already clicked in it.
30,000
You just
total
need to type.
prisoners, while the USSR's Gulag routinely held 2 million at a time. Though the term Gulag came about under Stalin, by 1921 Lenin was already running 84 various camps for potential enemies and those deemed to be unreliable elements. That number became an archipelago of over 30,000 camps under Stalin, and it was under his reign that the camps began to be used for slave labor, especially in areas universally understood to be inhospitable to human life. Since many of the imprisoned were highly educated and technically skilled, it is no surprise that every Soviet industry from farming to military design was supported by the forced labor of prisoners. The first Gulag camp is widely regarded to be Sovietsky, for this was the first camp that had been established by the Cheka independently of the larger Soviet justice system. It was there in 1926 where the concept of using forced labor as a method of re-education first began to be implemented. A converted former monastery, Solovetsky was located on a series of islands northwest of the city of Archangel. Roughly the same latitude as Fairbanks, Alaska, temperatures average from 4.6 degrees Fahrenheit in January to 61.7 degrees Fahrenheit in July. In 1923, there were a few hundred prisoners there, mostly political foes, including former allies of the Bolsheviks. By 1925, there were 6,000, including many of those who had fought in the Kronstadt Rebellion. That winter, a quarter of them would die due to the terrible conditions they were living under, including the high workload, poor food, and an epidemic of
On both.
disease.
We generally are higher for
It was
both.
Solovetsky and inhuman sadism we have come to associate
look
with
it up. We'll
concentration
see what the
camps are
latest is.
intact. Gulag historian Ann Applebaum writes that
You drive too?
guards had regularly left undressed prisoners in the old, unheated cathedral bell towers in the winter, their hands and feet tied behind their backs with a single piece of rope. They had also put prisoners to the bench, meaning they were forced to sit on poles for up to 18 hours without moving, sometimes with weights tied to their legs and their feet not touching the floor, a position guaranteed
So you're still on Borough
Sometimes
Court?
prisoners would be made to go naked to the baths up to 2 kilometers away in freezing weather, or they were deliberately given rotten meat, or they were refused medical help. At other times, prisoners would be given pointless,
Is the
unnecessary
email
tasks to
Mr.
move
Brown?
huge quantities of snow from one place
Just
to
M.
another, for
Brown's
example, or to
2021?
jump off bridges into rivers whenever a guard shouted, "Dolphin!" Political prisoners
One
under the
second.
Tsar, including Bolsheviks, had enjoyed a certain surprisingly high standard of living, with access to books, writing instruments, a fair amount of food, and even decent clothing. At the early stage of what would become the Gulag system, the prisoners still had the idea that they had rights. Their misconception was swiftly corrected. When one prisoner complained that someone had taken his parcel from home, he was stripped and tied to a post in the summer woods, helpless, while swarms of mosquitoes bled him dry. Others were executed,
Now you had,
sometimes en masse.
yeah, your
An
ID's still good. You don't
accusation
really
of
need to do
plotting
that
was
again.
enough of a pretense
You had
to kill
Vera
as many people
Savings
as the guards
as your direct
desired,
deposit.
with
Yeah.
little
You want to keep that?
possibility or time for
Okay.
the
All right.
captives to
Well, you're all set. I'm gonna send it to them, and
The arbitrary nature
hopefully
of the
they'll have an
murder
interview.
atmosphere
Probably
of constant
they usually do them like at
terror,
3 o'clock on Wednesday.
So Levyansky was just the beginning.
Goes
It was in
well.
Siberia where
They'll
the Gulag
let
system
me
grew
know
and
to
grew
have you
as
come
the
back the next day for
Bolsheviks increased their
orientation.
power over the Soviet
All right. I'll
citizenry.
send you all the info though
Rounding up
once
convicts
I
often
do
took
get
a fair amount of
confirmation from
time.
them.
They would at first be loaded into trucks which on the
All right,
outside
man.
were labeled
Got your
bread
phone
or
number.
fruits. They would
Let
sit
me just
organized in the shape of
make
chevron,
sure.
with one person spreading his legs so the next could sit between them, and so on with the next captive. In some cases, waiting in the severe cold caused permanent physical
Oh, you
damage
already
for the
you
adults
did
and
that as
death
an
for the
emergency number
child
too.
captives.
Okay, so that's
Even
the same
without
number.
such
Okay, you're
exchange,
good.
the train trip to the Far East was hardly idyllic.
So,
Lice and the
text
diseases
message,
they carried were
Gmail, phone
ubiquitous.
All right.
The
call.
simple
I'm gonna
need
send
to
it to you
relieve
right now, just
oneself
as a
was
test,
used as
just
a
to make sure
mechanism
that we
control
have it
by
in
some of the
this in
guards,
our
or even
system.
simple exercise in cruelty
Because
by
once
others.
once they
All
say
it took
yes,
was one prisoner
I'm
losing
gonna give
bowel
you all the
control
info.
or
Yeah,
getting
they're already
sick
popping
to
up
turn the
still
atmosphere
the
to
old
the
stuff.
carriage
All right, you're
even
good.
more unbearable. It often took a month for the trip from Moscow to the Siberian
There
Gulag
you
region
go.
of Kolyma, a month in which the prisoner was literally removed from his former life and basic human
I heard
civilization. The traveling
CJ worked
captives would
out pretty
often go
good
days
over
without any
here.
water, and
Chris
when they were
Johnson.
fortunate to receive their
I
one
was
full
working
cup, they would
for
have to
him.
choose between drinking it all at
And
once
then
or
I ended up
rationing
having
it
to do
out
stuff and
throughout the
everything
day.
else. I told
Passengers
him like
sticking out their
him
cups
because he's
between
working
the
at
window
Upper
bars
over
to
there in
catch rainfall
Telegraph.
would be threatened with getting shot.
Yeah, he worked out
Stops to
good.
discard the
Good.
deceased were
Hopefully
an
you did.
inevitable occurrence. It goes without
Got
saying
hired
that many of the
in.
infants
Well,
and
that's
children
definitely a
aboard
good
the
thing
train
then.
cars never made it to the
Yeah, I
camps.
know I never hear from anybody after they get hired in. I don't. They don't know. Like, other than hey man, where's my W-2? Which is cool. I'm happy when they do get hired in, man. That means they did a good job. Not today. If we need to do anything else, I'll reach out to you. Yeah. Yeah.
Cargo below deck when close to Japan. In at least one instance, a Russian ship hit a reef and the crew refused to ask for help lest the nature of their journey be exposed. There were, of course, no lifeboats for the prisoners, and though a few Japanese fishermen tried to assist, over 1,000 people died. Juvenile delinquents who
Okay,
so
no, I think you're okay.
system were
Let
found
me see where
here as
you're
well. They served a
at.
purpose
No,
in the sense
that's
of
not
keeping
it.
the captive
The
population in a state
username
of
here.
huddled
Let me
fear as they
stop
rebelled
stop
and
clicking
hurling
for a
abuse
second.
at the adults,
Let me
such
fix
as by
this.
spitting on them or urinating on them.
Let me get this
Actual
for you.
criminals are part of the trip too, seizing control of the ship's
Your
plank.
username didn't look
Murderers
like
and the
that. It
like,
looks
they far
like.
outnumbered the guards who themselves were often
Give
too
me a
afraid
second.
to intervene.
I can't pull up your
Finally
password, but I
tossing
can
fish
pull up your
guns at the political
username.
captives who dared to stick
And
out their heads, or by vomiting on those
this
in the
is
cargo
your
when they got
username.
seasick. These conditions made it harder and harder for the prisoners to think of themselves as civilized human beings with rights of any
There.
kind. Indeed, the
Now go ahead and type in what your password is. I put it in there for you.
legally and explicitly regarded as worse than mere murderers or rapists, or at least still
That's in Monroe, yes. That's right here. I actually have an office in one of their buildings, but so yeah, it's food production. They produce different types of food products. You're basically helping package them. Oh yeah, I got a big old beard. But I don't go in the back, so. All right. Well, I mean, if you have transportation, we're hiring for a place in Temperance. It's called Synchrion. It's actually they're pulling parts and stuff for warranty. Okay. Well, yeah, they're often looking for forklift drivers as well. So, you want to come by tomorrow? Okay. Well, there is a split shift on that one, where you can work Monday and Tuesday at night, and then it's mornings on Friday and Saturday. Well, they're 10-hour shifts, so yeah, that's 40 hours. So you're welcome. Reach out to me anytime, though. And if you want to be ahead of the game, just go ahead and go to our website and at least get yourself registered in the system. So that'll be we're at 317 West Front Street. Yep, bye. He's just gonna come by. No appointment. He's just gonna come by.
And they alone are responsible for everything that goes wrong in our country. They must be annihilated. Guards would be threatened or bribed by criminals to let men into the separate women's hold, gangs of whom had their way with the female captives one after another. One eyewitness described such a raid. Several men attacked each
I'll
other.
reset it to this for now, and then it'll let you change it what you want it to be, okay?
Kicking forcefully, their hands clawing the men's faces. The women bit, cried, and wailed. The rapists smacked them back. When the rapists
If you do the wrong one too many times, it locks you out too. So
and hunted for young men.
give me a second.
These adolescents were added to the carnage, lying still in their stomachs, bleeding and crying on the floor. The male captives, hundreds of them, sat there watching the whole thing. Any man who tried to assist would be crushed to death,
Right.
as happened during another such raid.
Let
After the
me
guards
type it for
blasted
you.
the hold with water to end the raid, they went down and dragged out both the women who had been injured and those who had been killed. Much of the skepticism about conditions in the Soviet Union was based on the very rational
There you go.
premise
Now
that
make
this
it what
sort of
you want it to
mistreatment
be.
made no sense.
There.
For a large number of the captives who finally reached the camps were useless in terms of labor due to the horrors that they had suffered en route. Horrors that in some cases could have been prevented by simply allowing them to have water. But that would have been extra work for the guards, who had little incentive to lift a finger to assist a group of people who had officially been declared to no longer be members of society or even the human race. Arriving at the camps, the captives were greeted
House
by
chat is
various
usually pretty
signs,
busy.
with one example being the claim that, with just work, I will pay my debt to the fatherland, reminiscent of Auschwitz's notorious Arbeit macht frei sign. Signage reminded the prisoners that he who does not work does not eat, but he who did work often didn't eat much either. Being too weak to fulfill one's work quota was often taken as evidence of the alleged counter-revolutionary behavior that got a person sent to the camps to begin with. Here at last were the wreckers made flesh, continuing their intransigence against the People's Republic. There was an idea in Kremlin circles that the camps should become economically self-sustaining. A caste system was developed early on, with prisoners divided between heavy workers who got the most food, light workers, and invalids who received half the food rations of the strong group. The critique that capitalism leads to the rich getting richer was here implemented as the organizing principle, with the strong getting stronger while the weakest grew weaker, simply due to caloric intake alone. It was by 1937, during the Great Terror, where the nature of the camps took a turn. Stalin now sent regional quotas to the NKVD, telling them how many people he expected to be arrested, with the numbers broken down by each given region. It then became their role to find that amount of men and women to arrest and send away. If Stalin said to find 10,000 criminals in, say, the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic, the secret police would arrest 10,000 people regardless of whether that many criminals existed there or not. Instead of merely being exploitative with poor living conditions causing many to perish, the Gulag now became a place where the deaths of prisoners was regarded not as an accident or a cost or an afterthought, but as an outright goal. Outdoor work in the camps was compulsory all year round, only pausing if the temperature reached 50 degrees below. Working inside was not much better. Coal miners had to deal
Your
with
maternal
severe
name.
short-term and long-term consequences. In 1937, Stalin had also decided that the prisoners are being coddled. Thereafter,
That is a
it was
long
forbidden for
password.
the prisoners to use fur to stay warm. They were forced to use wadding for protection and to walk in canvas shoes instead
You
of
can
felt
change the
boots.
question
If
too,
they
though. You
had
can
or
change
if
it
the shoes at all,
to
which
like
many did not. Siberian
your dream
blizzards
job
are
as
so
a child?
notorious in their ferocity that even Westerners now fear them. All of this contributed to a near total extermination rate in some locations, with Soviet sources themselves reporting a death rate of 97 to 98% of the inmates. When one free citizen tried to warn camp administrators that people in the camps might die, the response from the camp representative was clear. What people? These are enemies of the people. Other officials were as blunt. We are not trying to bring down the mortality rate. Captives were forbidden to refer to themselves as comrades, which was the standard greeting of the rest of the egalitarian Soviet Union. And in a bizarre but logical twist, despite the increasing ubiquity of his image in the greater USSR at large, simply looking at Stalin's picture was also not allowed to them. Nevertheless, the captives were still often subject to workshops where the speakers blathered political ideology at them. One Polish Jew who got swept into the Gulag recalled how a professional agitator with the mentality of a 6-year-old child
No,
would address
I
the
don't have a
prisoners on the nobility
Instagram.
of putting all their effort into work. He would tell them that noble people are patriots, that all patriots love Soviet Russia, the best country in the world for the working man, that Soviet citizens are proud to belong to such a country, etc., etc., for 2 solid hours. All this to an audience whose very skins bore witness to the absurdity and hypocrisy of such statements. For hours and hours the lecture went on, recalled another camp survivor, trying to prove that God did not exist, that he was nothing but some bourgeois invention. We should consider ourselves lucky to have found ourselves among the Soviets, the most perfect country in the world. Here in the camp, we should learn how to work and at last become decent people. In our camps, you were expected not only to be a slave laborer, but to sing and smile while you worked as well, another former prisoner told Applebaum. We didn't just want to oppress us, they wanted us to thank them for it. Prisoners often had to be beaten in order to get them to bathe in the freezing cold rooms that they would then have to stand around and naked afterward. In the Soviet Union, the average person frequently had difficulty getting enough to eat, and in the Gulag, food was disgusting even by prison conditions, often watery soups with fish heads or a piece of fat floating inside. Some prisoners were forced to eat outdoors, where the soup invariably froze. Antipathy toward organized religion was central to the communist state, and there was great pressure to break the spirits of prisoners who relied on their faith. One group of female prisoners refused to wear numbered clothing due to the dictates of their religion, so the numbers were stamped directly onto their skin. For added humiliation, they were forced to attend camp roll calls in the nude. In 1930, another religious group regarded Soviet passports, money, and the like as symbols of the Antichrist and refused to have anything to do with it. They were shipped to an island in the White Sea and told they could have food only if they signed for it. When they repeatedly refused, they were simply left there to starve to death, which they naturally all did. Diseases of malnutrition like pellagra were common in the camps, worsened by the theft of food by everyone from guards down to those prisoners working to prepare the meals. Peeling potatoes is viewed as a punishment in the American military, but in the Gulag it was a highly coveted role that might have saved the given prisoner's life due to having access to nutrition. As with other prisons, cultural mores developed within the mini societies that each camp became, with unspoken rules being enforced with, in some cases, extreme brutality. If a prisoner stole clothes, tobacco, or almost anything else that was discovered, he could expect a beating from his fellow prisoners, recalled one survivor of the Gulag. But the unwritten rule of the camp was that a prisoner caught stealing another's bread earned a death sentence. Specifically, the thief would be tossed into the air over and over until he was seriously injured, and then be thrown out of the barracks by his fellow prisoners to die. The Kolyma Basin is a huge Arctic region named for the river that cuts through it, though most of the rivers in the area are icebound for 8 to 9 months per year. At one point, it held the distinction for recording the lowest temperature on Earth. There was a song in Russia about the climate. Kolyma, wonderful land. 12 months winter, the rest summer. For about 2 months winter, there's no sunrise at all. The brutal cold forced inmates to get creative in order to stay alive, and one of humanity's earliest mechanisms for maintaining warm bodies was practiced between prisoners or between female prisoners and guards. As a result of this, pregnancy in the Gulag was not an entirely uncommon phenomenon. Those children who managed to survive through to birth were fed by their mothers but housed separately from them, possibly for the best given the conditions that prisoners lived under. After a year, the babies were permanently taken from their mothers and handed over to the secret police. You have broken the regulations, the women were told. Connections with men are not permitted. Therefore, the children are ours, not yours. They belong to the security organs, and we will bring them up. Estimates range as to whether it was 500,000 or 1 million such infants were seized over the years. Those infants still fared better than children who were imprisoned in the Gulag themselves, where even being 7 years old was not enough to stave off beatings and humiliations, not to mention the omnipresent cold and hunger. Parentless boys and girls who were taken to associated children's homes had to deal with all the above, as well as sexual assaults both from older children and administrators. Those who grew up in the inhuman conditions of the Gulag grew up to themselves become something inhuman, as recalled former prisoner Les Razgan. They feared nothing and no one. The guards and camp bosses were scared to enter the separate barracks where the juveniles lived. It was there that the vilest, most cynical and cruel acts that took place in the camps occurred. If one of the prisoners' criminal leaders was gambling, lost everything, and had staked his life as well, the boys would kill him for a day's bread ration or simply for the fun of it. The girls boasted that they could satisfy an entire team of tree fellers. One need not have grown up in the gulag to become transformed by it. When World War II came, strict new regulations came with it. A ukaz was issued which provided that any worker who left his job in a war plant, no matter for what reasons, was subject to from 6 to 8 years of imprisonment. Hundreds of young girls between the ages of 18 and 20 were sent to Kalima for running away to their villages because they could no longer endure the starvation in the cities where they had been forced to work. Some had only gone back home for a few days to visit a sick mother, but the factory manager would not give them any days off, and when they returned, they were arrested. They came as adolescents and were instantly transformed by Kalima into full-fledged prostitutes. Much like being an NKVD head, running the gulag was a powerful but personally very dangerous position. Gulag Chief Fyodor Eichmanns was shot in 1938, and his two successors both shot one after another in 1939. All this fed into the mentality of, if only Stalin knew. True believers in the communist system explained away their own personal imprisonment as a plot.
I'm just going to use the temp one for now so we can get this through the process.
Intelligence services or the ubiquitous invisible wreckers. Others better understood the consequences of a system built on destroying such bourgeois ideas as individualism, insisting that the repressions are a historical necessity for the development of our society. Escape was impossible because there was simply nowhere to go in the Arctic.
1 second, let me fix it.
To help an escapee would be a life-threatening risk in a region so unfitted to habitation to begin with. Herling Brzezinski discusses the story of one man who managed to get out of his gulag, finally finding a nearby village after a week of wandering and then collapsing inside of the first hut that he found. The camp chief had reportedly never even bothered to send out a search team, knowing that the man would either die in the forest or come back to the camp. Indeed, the peasants drove him back to the camp, and there the guards took him to the internal prison, where, still unconscious, he was beaten so cruelly that for 3 months he was near death, and even after his life had been saved, he had to remain in the hospital for another 2 months. The escapee survived only in order to serve as a living
give you written
testament to
copies
the
of all
hopelessness
this.
of the prisoners' situations. You can't escape from the camp, my friends, he repeatedly warned his fellows. Freedom isn't for
Some of
us.
it you
We're
will have to
chained
fill
this
out,
place
but
for the rest
the
of our
rest of it
lives,
will
even
just,
though we
I'll
aren't
give you a
wearing
written copy
chains.
of
We
it.
can escape, we can
Here you go.
wander about,
Start with
but in
that
the
form
end,
there.
we'll come back.
Last
That's
name?
our fate, our cursed fate. Indeed, suicide wasn't even an option, but not because it wasn't tempting. The chief reason for the relatively low rate of suicide, explained one captive, is the fact that prisoners are never alone. The workload was as varied as industry could be. The Guide to the System of Corrective Labor Camps of the USSR recounts the existence of camps organized around gold mines, coal mines, nickel mines, highway and railway construction, arms factories, chemical factories, metal processing plants, electricity plants, the building of
How you spell
airports,
your last
apartment blocks, sewage systems, the digging of peat, the
Yep.
cutting of trees, and
That's
the
fine.
killing of fish. Picture albums demonstrate the production
then your
of
first
everything
name?
up to and including the proverbial kitchen sink, including mines, missiles, and other army equipment, car parts, door locks, buttons, logs floating down rivers, wooden furniture, including chairs, cabinets, telephone boxes, and barrels, shoes, baskets, and textiles with samples attached, rugs,
Sorry.
leather, fur hats,
First name
sheepskin
goes in the
coats,
first name blank.
dust lamps,
There
and
you go.
drawers, soap and candles, even toys, wooden tanks, tiny windmills, and mechanical rabbits playing drums. It is not an exaggeration to say that the economy of the Soviet Union was heavily
Alright.
predicated on, if not entirely
and then
based on, the forced
you have the
labor of
hyphenated
hundreds
last
of
name, but you
thousands
don't
of
have a middle
innocent
name,
people
right?
kept imprisoned in the
Okay.
camps of the Gulag.
So we're gonna do
It
this.
only took a geological discovery in a remote
Address.
region to launch a ship of thousands of prisoners in icy storms in the spring of 1940. When they landed, they then had to build their new prisons while the guards stood by with bayonets. When a hurricane came, the guards and prisoners were washed away alike, only leaving those who had managed to tie themselves to the posts that had been put up. Only a few hundred eventually managed to return to Magadan a year later, where the doctors proceeded to remove those body parts that had been taken by frostbite. As the prisoner nurse later wrote, not one failed to pay for his life with frozen hands or feet, frozen ears, nose, or cheeks. Contact with the outside world was mixed at best. Some prisoners would be allowed visits with family members a couple of times a year.
All right, one
but even
second.
that was predicated on the family knowing where the captive had been taken. Worse,
Your apartment
maintaining
number?
contact with someone convicted of being a counter-revolutionary or a gulag was very risky behavior. Some wives
244?
had the decency to visit in order to tell their spouses to their
224.
face that they had decided to divorce, and they could hardly
And that's
be
Monroe?
Letters and packages sent into and out of the camps were subject to inspection by guards in a country where even someone with
Birthday?
impeccable class consciousness could expect to have their mail read by the authorities, and where the
Hang on,
postal
I'll pull it
service
up here.
hardly operated with any semblance of
Be quiet.
efficiency. Voting
August
gifts were
13th,
primed for
80s.
plunder by the guards, whereas letters piled up in stacks of thousands by guards who could not be bothered to distribute them. Families would assume the worst when their letters would be unreplied to, while prisoners would assume that they had been disowned when they had no contact from their loved ones. Even for the administrators themselves, basic stationery and writing implements were hardly ubiquitous. A prisoner who possessed such
Email
items
address,
could
go ahead and
easily be
type that out.
construed as sending secret missives against the authorities. For every captive whose life was saved by a parcel of food sent from home that somehow got past the guards, it took 3 years in one critical case. There were many more whose starvation or malnutrition could have been prevented if they simply got what had been mailed to them. The slave camps of the Nazis and President Truman's victory over them is widely remembered today, but the Gulag and Henry Wallace are largely forgotten. Though the level of appreciation for Truman has increased over the decades, during his 1948 election campaign, he was popularly regarded as a bit of a screw-up who lucked his way into the presidency. "We're just mild about Harry" was the slogan for the day, and it was a given that after 4 Democrat terms in the White House, the next president would be another New York governor, Republican Thomas Dewey. Truman's 1948 upset election victory was captured by the famous photo of him holding up the mistaken Chicago Daily Tribune headline reading, "Dewey defeats Truman." What is less known is that Truman would later go on to win the record for the lowest ever approval rating for a president as recorded by Gallup, hitting a shocking 22%, lower than even Nixon would ever get. But there were 2 other major candidates running in 1948, Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond and reviving the Progressive Party, Henry Wallace. A darling of the left, Wallace played to independents and Democrats who were disaffected by Truman. He scored some major endorsements, including architect Frank Lloyd Wright, inspiration for the protagonist of the Fountainhead, NAACP founder W.B. Du Bois, and Harold and the Purple Crayon creator Crockett Johnson. Albert Einstein was also a supporter of Wallace's, while on the other hand, filmmaker Orson Welles refused to have anything to do with him. Welles regarded him as a prisoner of the Communist Party who would never do anything to upset them. "I was very, very passionately against him," Welles said. "The left thought I was a real traitor." As late as 1948, long after World War II had ended, Wallace's warmth towards Stalinism was not a deal-breaker for the influencers, but denouncing Wallace was. The Wallace campaign did a fair amount of work to allow President Truman to position himself as the common-sense centrist he is widely remembered as today. Wallace finished 4th with a little over 1 million votes and 2.4% of the vote total, a significantly smaller vote share than socialist Eugene V. Debs had received when he had run for the presidency in 1920 while incarcerated. As time went on, information came out from prisoners who had been there when Vice President Wallace had visited Magadan. One schoolboy at the time remembered Wallace's visit vividly because the most unusual thing was that suddenly the windows of the shops were full of Soviet foodstuffs. God knows where this stuff came from. After Wallace left, the products of course vanished as quickly as they had appeared. In 1951, Wallace's reputation took another hit when Regnery published Eleanor Lipper's memoir of life in the Gulag, 11 years in Soviet prison camps. Lipper had been a Swiss national before being caught in the Gulag's web, and as a result was one of the very few people released from the camps who were later allowed to leave the Soviet Union. The book specifically discussed what conditions were like at Magadan, where Lipper spent a total of 8 years, including during Wallace's trip. It was yet another piece of evidence that Wallace had been utterly played for a fool by the Soviets. "Every prisoner who was there at the time owes Mr. Wallace a debt of gratitude," she scoffed.
All right, so we're good for today. If they do call for some people, I'll have to bring you back in just to do the safety stuff, but we're all set. Thank you for coming by.
To make certain he could accidentally see them in the yard, these were shown to the prisoners from morning until night for 3 days. Reading Wallace's friendly words about Ivan Nikishov, a key official in Magadan, Lipper wrote that it is too bad that Wallace never saw him gambling around on one of his drunken rages around the prison camps, raining filthy savage language upon the heads of the exhausted, starving prisoners, having them locked up in solitary confinement for no offense.
I was thinking I was going to be able to sit down and eat when I got here.
14 and 16 hours a day,
I didn't realize people were here waiting.
Would these words bear repetition when the mounds of roasting corpses into the snow are one day disinterred to testify what the Soviet Union really is? She demanded of the rosy claims of Wallace and his fellow travelers. It was in September 1952, in what would have been the last months of Wallace's second term as president, that Wallace finally admitted that he had been fooled by Stalin and his men.
Can you guys hear, Michael?
I had the slightest idea when I visited Magadan that this far north Pacific port, center of a vast subarctic goldfield, was also the center for administering the labor of both criminals and those suspected of political disloyalty, Wallace wrote. Nothing I saw at Magadan or anywhere else in Soviet Asia suggested slave labor. True, I had heard that many kulaks who had their farms taken from them in the early 30s had been sent to Siberia, but I had not the slightest idea that there were many slave labor camps in Siberia in 1944, and that of these the most notorious was Magadan. By 1952, there remained apologists for the USSR in the West, but far fewer flat-out advocates. As Wallace himself concluded, more and more I am convinced that Russian communism, in its total disregard of truth, in its fanaticism, its intolerance, and its resolute denial of God and religion, is something utterly evil. By this point, Robert Hannigan, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, who had been so instrumental in replacing FDR's running mate in 1944, had passed away at the very early age of 46. His St. Louis tombstone is simply inscribed Robert Emmett Hannigan, June 30, 1903, October 6, 1949. Unlike at the convention, his wishes were not honored. Hannigan had quipped that he wanted his tombstone to read, "Here lies the man who stopped Henry Wallace from becoming President of the United States." Chapter 9. Waiting for the doorbell to ring. Hitler and the Nazis were defeated in 1945. It was the Russians who had reached his bunker first, proudly raising the hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union over the Reichstag as well. Whereas the United States had lost a bit over 400,000 men in World War II, the USSR lost somewhere between 8 and 12 million, in addition to a similar number of civilians. Further, Stalin sent many Russian ex-POWs to the Gulag upon their return to the USSR, both as punishment for having been captured and to isolate their knowledge about the outside world from the rest of the population. After World War II was won, dominion over Eastern Europe was largely ceded to the Soviet Union.
In general, yeah.
Powers. All the land that Lenin had
Am I happy with the world
Treaty
in
of
its state?
Brest-Litovsk had
Of course
been
not.
regained by Stalin. Bulgaria, Poland, Hungary, and Romania all had governments installed that answered to Moscow.
Kind of a morphing state of mind.
Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania fared even worse, losing their status as nations and becoming incorporated into the USSR as new Soviet socialist republics. No one knew what to do with the Japanese colony of Korea, so they just drew a line down the middle in order to form a communist north and a capitalist south. In Churchill's
sometimes.
March 5th, 1946 words, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and, in many cases, increasing measure of control from Moscow. The Cold War had begun. For a brief period, the United States had been the world's only nuclear power, but a spying of Stalinists and fellow ideologues in various American classified agencies delivered the bomb to the Soviet Union by the end of the 1940s. By 1948, Czechoslovakia would also become taken over by a Soviet-led coup. The Cold War turned violent, with each half of Korea declaring itself the rightful government of the entire country. This led to the Korean War, where the United States and the newfound United Nations joined the forces of South Korea against the North Koreans with their Soviet allies, with now communist China also lending a hand. The war effectively ended in a draw, and the Korean people paid the price with the utter decimation of their country. Alongside Stalin through all this was the last...
Maybe that's why I'm so happy right now, because they're good. They're cold,
Beria is not
but
as
hot.
widely remembered as that of high-ranking Nazis like Joseph
Definitely
Goebbels,
clearing out my
Hitler,
nose.
or Rudolf Hess. The thing he is most
Kroger
remembered for
specials
is
here.
his infamous quote, "Show me the man, and I'll show you the crime." This wasn't some throwaway line either. As the third and last of Stalin's NKVD leaders, Beria was in charge of the secret
Bones?
police and expanding the Gulag, with all that entailed.
Or the wings.
Let me have one night with him, and I'll have him confessing he's the king of England. He bragged about one of his many captives. As one anecdote put it, one nasty morning, Comrade Stalin discovered that his favorite pipe was missing. Naturally, he called in his henchman Lavrenti Beria and instructed him to find the pipe. A few hours later, Stalin found it in his desk and called it the search. But Comrade Stalin, stammered Beria, 5 suspects have already confessed to stealing it. While Beria knew what sort of stress his work to get confessions out of the accused, he was also well aware of the limited efficacy of such methods. As he eventually
Going down well, though,
a person
I'll tell you
that's
that.
beaten will give the kind of confession that the interrogating agents want, will admit that he's an English or American spy or whatever we want, but it will never
Is Anna
be
still here
possible
listening?
to know the truth this way. This, of course, did not deter Beria.
Or am I
or his
playing
men
this
in the
just for me?
slightest. When we Bolsheviks want to get something done, he once said, we close our eyes to everything else. He was uniquely suited to run the secret police and be the pure ruthlessness. Beria is a man for whom it costs nothing to kill his best friend.
Chicken bones aren't all that great for dogs.
About Beria, noted one of his subordinates. It is clear why he got along so well with Stalin. In some limited respects, Beria was less of a butcher than his predecessors. When he took over from Yezhov in 1938, the worst of the Great Terror receded, and the number of victims caught began to decrease. Yet this mitigation of the wholesale assault on the populace was in contrast to the personal depravity that Beria himself visited on so many men, women, and children who fell under his command. The vegetarian had no qualms about inflicting enormous suffering on human beings and even relished the opportunity. His coup de grace might have been getting an agent past
Well, the wife
security
used to
and
work as
after
a
several
vet
failed
tech,
attempts
and
at
she's seen seen too many of them get
successfully
perforated
assassinated
esophaguses
with a ice
and
pick to the head in
stomachs.
his
So.
Mexico City home in 1940. If Show Me the Man could be viewed
Only
as
bones
Barry's
the dogs get are
professional
long
slogan,
bones,
his personal
like
one can be
femurs and
illustrated
stuff
by his
from
response to Tatiana
cows.
Okunievskaya. Okunievskaya was a popular actress, and Barry invited her to perform for the Politburo. When she accepted the invitation, he instead took her to a private home where he proceeded to try to get her drunk. Then, Barry undressed and began to seduce her. To further entice her, he promised to free both her father and her grandfather from prison. Scream or not, it doesn't matter, he told her. After he had his way with her and let her go, he nevertheless had her arrested and sent to Siberia. Nor did Barry keep his word about her family, because he couldn't. Both Okunievskaya's father and grandfather had already been executed. The unfortunate actress was not alone, for Barry was one of the worst sexual predators of all time. Barry had his men drive him around Moscow looking for women to pick up. Resistance from them would lead to extreme consequences, and compliance was not often a better option. 50 years after Barry's death, they were still finding the remains of his victims on the grounds of his former home. With the bureaucrat's obsessive attention to detail, both Barry and his bodyguard kept records of all the women that he engaged with. There does remain some dispute as to whether his sexual predations reached literal children or if he contented himself with mere teenagers. Stalin was quite aware of Berya's predilections. The man who had an entire country living in fear of him was still concerned about what Berya was capable of. When Stalin learned his daughter was at Berya's house, he called her in a panic and told her to leave right away. Notably, Stalin was more than
This is
happy to
Michael
look the other way,
Malice,
so
The
long
White
as
Pill,
Berya was performing
Chapter
his job
9.
to Stalin's satisfaction. This fit in with Stalin's broader perspective on the utility of sexual assault. Stalin made this point explicitly when privately
The audio
facing
book.
criticism of the Red Army's transgressions as it made its way west toward Berlin. Do you see what a complicated thing is a man's soul, a man's psyche? Well then, imagine a man who has fought from Stalingrad to Belgrade over thousands of kilometers of his own devastated land across the dead bodies of his comrades and dearest ones. How can such a man react normally? And what is so awful in his having fun with a woman after such horrors? When Stalin wasn't looking the other way regarding the Red Army's rapes, he was actively engaging it to perform mass murder. After he had invaded Poland in 1939, Stalin was stocked with tens of thousands of Polish prisoners of war that included many of the Polish intellectual elite. This had the potential to be a new anti-Soviet power center, which therefore had the potential to be a threat to Stalin's power. Beria, Stalin, and other top Soviet officials had a frank discussion about just what was to be done with the Polish captives. After much blunt talk came the decision: execution. Matters looked very different 2 years later. Stalin was incredulous when Hitler broke their pact and invaded the Soviet Union under
Pretty
Operation
far. This is
Barbarossa. The Red
chapter
Army
9
desperately
of
awaited
like
instruction from the
13
Kremlin for
chapters.
days,
Yeah.
as Stalin went missing, unable to believe what the reports were telling him from the front. The
16
Nazis
chapters.
made massive advances and preventable ones. Worse,
So,
Stalin's
about halfway.
marches had wiped out most of Russia's best and brightest military leaders just a few years prior. Everything's lost, a dejected Stalin said. Lenin left us a great legacy, but we, his heirs, have shitted out our asses. As the Nazis worked their way east, they uncovered mass graves in Russia's cotton forest. It was there where Beria's men had left the remains of all the massacred Polish prisoners of war. It was a major
Wrapping it up here.
international embarrassment for Stalin, and Russian claims that the dead were victims of the Nazis were met with great skepticism. The Katyn massacre would be used for decades as evidence of the basic inhumanity underlying Stalin's regime. Though Stalin's relationship with Hitler vacillated between rivals to non-aggressors to co-conspirators
Emma
against
Goldman.
both to outright foes, there was one group that the two men both despised: Jews. Stalin's anti-Semitism was heavily informed by a couple of things. To begin with, Russia had historically been one of the most anti-Semitic countries on earth, both de facto and de jure. The promise of not only equality but mere safety in one's home drew a large percentage of Jews towards socialism both in Russia and abroad. This cultural tendency was compounded in Stalin by his personal hatred toward Trotsky. When Stalin met with Churchill and FDR at Yalta to plan against Hitler, he still found time to rant to the president about how Jews were parasites. Stalin's comments were dutifully censored from the official English version of the conversation. As historian Louis Rappaport pointed out, in the spirit of the Stalin-Hitler pact, all Soviet organs deliberately remained silent about the genocidal
so good.
slaughtering of the Jews by the Nazi conquerors of
Brew
Poland
Doctor
between
Kombucha.
September 1939 and June 1941, when the Nazis invaded the USSR. The silence continued even after Hitler invaded his former partner's empire. Stalin
Yeah, I've got a few of his books. This is the first one I've actually listened to all the way through, though.
unsuspecting Jews in White Russia and
I'm
the
not paying
Ukraine.
enough attention
Any
to it,
references to mass
obviously.
killings by the Third Reich were discussed in the Soviet press as simply targeting Poles or Ukrainians. The Nazis themselves were understandably baffled by Jewish obliviousness regarding Hitler's intentions in the western part of the Soviet Union. The Jews are strikingly ill-informed about our attitude towards them and about the treatment Jews are receiving in Germany or Warsaw, said one Nazi report. Although they do not expect to be granted equal rights with the Russians under the German administration, they do believe that we will let them alone if they apply themselves diligently to their work. When the Germans invaded the Ukrainian town of Korostia, the Jewish population accordingly greeted them with food as a welcome. No family, even his own, was safe from Stalin's.
I'm gonna end it at the end of this
When
chapter.
Stalin's son's Yasha was captured by Hitler's men,
17
Stalin
minutes
had Yasha's
left.
Jewish wife arrested as a plotter and thereby left his
Thank you
3-year-old
guys for being
granddaughter without
patient and
parents.
hanging out.
Abandoned by his father, Yasha killed himself a few months later.
Yeah.
Stalin's daughter later fell in love with a Jewish screenwriter.
They do pay me for that, though. Do that, so I gotta deal with it. I think I got this guy's pay situation fixed, though.
Despite the fact that she had only shared kisses with her crush. As the war proceeded, any Jews in the Soviet Union who felt the need to organize came under great suspicion. Arrests of prominent Jewish writers and activists with international reputations could not simply be explained away easily. The Polish ambassador to the USSR demanded the release of the Bund, Poland's strongest and largest Jewish party, would fall in Russian hands. He was told that it has been established that they were working on behalf of Germany. When he protested the absurdity of Jews from Poland working on behalf of Hitler, his protests were met with a shrug. And yet Trotsky turned out to be a German agent. Jews were arrested en masse and put on trial in the Soviet Union and Soviet-dominated countries, and then those same trials were used as proof of a Jewish conspiracy. In 1948, the Soviet Union became the first country to recognize the newly declared state of Israel, expecting Israel to be a bulwark against the West due to violent conflict between the Israelis and the British rulers. Months later, Stalin saw this would not be the case and refused to allow Soviet Jews to emigrate. Future Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir was Israel's first ambassador to the Soviet Union, visiting Moscow in September of 1948, when tens of thousands of Russian Jews came out to welcome him. Stalin ordered the arrest of any one of them who could be identified from photographs of the event. During World War II, a Soviet organization called the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was created to mobilize world opinion to help the USSR fight against Hitler. After the war, any Soviet Jew who wrote to them inquiring about Israel, a land where Jews would be safe from persecution, was arrested. Stalin's campaign against the USSR's Jewish population came with the same tortures and farcical accusations as had taken place in the Great Terror. Jewish intellectuals and writers began to be systematically driven from their jobs as traitors, and many of them were arrested too. Lena Stern was the USSR's most prominent female scientist, a so-called Einstein in skirts, whose discoveries regarding the blood-brain barrier still hold up decades later. That didn't save the 71-year-old woman from arrest. Her interrogators called her an old whore and claimed that when she was at conferences abroad, she had sold her body.
I mean, the premise in the first paragraph I'm reading
many of her co-defendants were shot, she managed to receive the
is that he didn't denounce, that Donald Trump didn't denounce it. He did. So, this is the same thing as Joe Biden's supposed premise as to why he ran, because he said good people, after saying he completely denounces any of the supremacy stuff.
Throughout his life, Stalin liked to drink and he liked to smoke. Even as he entered his 70s, he would host drunken parties that lasted until 5 in the morning.
Initial refusal to denounce it. He denounced it in the same speech before he said that.
Deteriorated towards the end of his life, this was taken as proof that, obviously, the medical community was conspiring to kill him. Just as the wreckers had caused the health of the Soviet economy to falter, so it made perfect sense that Stalin's health was being wrecked by the top experts in the field. After all, he had finally quit smoking after 50 years. Stalin's doctor was obviously the best that the Kremlin had to offer, but when he advised total rest, Stalin repeatedly screamed for the man to be
I think he's just
not his informed medical opinion,
truthfully portraying the history of that time.
remembered Lenin getting the same advice after his first stroke, and he knew better.
He said a lot of stupid things too, though.
Stalin had reason to be suspicious. It is a certainty that
So many times that I was just like, dude, shut the fuck up.
as his personal murderers on
You're not doing a bad job, but you're making it worse by opening your fucking mouth.
Who, as education leader in Russia, had argued that children must learn about factories and mines and farms and how to increase production. Stalin had never forgiven her for siding with Kamenev and Zinoviev after Lenin died, and as the years passed, her relationship with Lenin had been publicly downgraded to friend, companion, and finally assistant. She died the day after her 70th birthday celebration in 1939 at the height of the Great Terror, and there was no shortage of suspicion that her death had not been due to natural causes. Dr. Myron Vovsi was designated as having been one of the central figures in a Jewish-guided doctor's plot to murder Stalin and overthrow the USSR for the sake of some foreign nation, which shifted from the United States to Britain to Israel. A few years and a few miles from Auschwitz, the same wheels were turning
I'm reading some of the
again.
reviews, though, for that book, so it looks like
Told
people
him,
are
"We can't let our enemies
understanding
misbehave.
that.
You will be punished. We'll get rid of you and your filthy race." Hitler was our enemy, but he was right about the Jews, that they are vermin who must be destroyed. We'll bury you and your filthy race 10 meters deep. We will never let our corn grow too high. We cut it at the right time. A cadre of doctors was arrested, and Stalin explicitly demanded they be tortured. He insisted that the interrogators throw the doctors into chains, beat them to a pulp, and grind them into powder. Once again, virtually all of them confessed to whatever was asked of them. The Soviet press began to increase references to rootless cosmopolitans and other universally loosely understood euphemisms for Jews that had been popularized by the Third Reich. Commissions were set up for the purposes of removing Jews from medical facilities. Jewish medical school graduates began to be assigned to the Far East to practice. Open letters were written for publication in Pravda, cleverly demanding that Jews be sent to the Far East in order to protect them, because Soviet people are naturally outraged by the ever-widening circle of treason and treachery, and the fact that, to our sorrow, many Jews have helped our enemies to form a fifth column in our midst. Simple, misguided citizens may be driven to striking back indiscriminately against Jews. In Stalin's native Georgia, government agents brought dynamite to blow up synagogues. They chose to bide their time until the defiant Jews were deported rather than face resistance. The message was heard loud and clear throughout the communist nations. Mao's doctor in China was a Soviet Jew. Agents were sent to arrest the man for supposedly trying to poison him. The president of Jewish advocacy organization B'nai B'rith met with U.S. State Department officials and told them flatly that he believed that the Soviets have decided on a campaign of extermination. After all, the Soviet Union already had a functioning concentration camp system with an enormously high casualty rate. It seemed as if the Jews would need a miracle to stop the worst from happening again, and they got one. It is not clear who precisely discovered Stalin on March 1st, 1953. After neither his household staff nor his subordinates heard from him all day, a brave soul finally dared to enter his chambers to check in on him. Whoever it was found him on the floor, immobile but alive, in a pool of his own urine. Now the staff were in a dilemma about what to do. Nothing of import could be done in the Soviet Union without Stalin's approval, yet Stalin was clearly unable to grant it. Beria was informed, and then he got on the phone, but that only put the sword of Damocles over his head. He knew perfectly well what had happened to his predecessors, Yezhov and Yagida. If it looked as if he were plotting against Stalin, he could be killed. If it looked as if he was conspiring with the doctors who had supposedly been plotting against Stalin, he could be killed. After much hand-wringing, the decision was made the following morning to ask the Minister of Health to get help. There was one major problem. The best doctors of the country would have been the ones assigned to Stalin.
You like this?
And other Soviet officials, and those were the men who Stalin had accused.
This review is kind of boring, but very informative. I decided to read this after learning that a family member has gotten deeply involved with white supremacy. I have my doubts, but let's go. Let's proceed. I'm already involved in many social justice causes, but haven't involved myself in the kind of direct action that Antifa is known for. Overall, I enjoyed the book, and I felt I got a lot of very useful information out of it. I don't see myself getting deeply involved in some of the more radical of Antifa's activities, but I do think overall the movement is a good one. Then they don't want you if you're not going to be part of their radicalness. And the book did convince me to start taking some self-defense class training just in case I need to defend myself from violent white supremacists in the course of my other activism work. It's pretty intellectual, so it felt slow to listen to at times. I guess I expected a book about militant anti-racist punk rockers to be a little more riveting, LOL. Also, I could have done without the accents the dude reading it in. It did. That was cheesy and obnoxious, still worth a listen. Don't know.
Of plotting against him. In what can be seen as either the height of irony or the epitome of farce, though probably both, the doctors who were being held in government torture chambers at that moment began to be questioned for medical advice. What specialist would you recommend for one of our most important people who had just had a stroke? One was asked. Unbeknownst to him, all 8 of the specialists he recommended were also imprisoned. The captors had still more questions. Despite his confusion, the physician nevertheless did his best to explain what a Cheyne-Stokes respiration was. He was unaware that that had been the tentative diagnosis reached by the clueless doctors who had been sent to attend to dying Stalin. Men so incompetent they couldn't even figure out how to operate the artificial respirator. Stalin's Dr. Svetlana was there to see the end. As her biographer Rosemary Sullivan described it, Stalin's death throes were agonizing. For several days he lay unconscious, choking on his own fluids as a cerebral hemorrhage spread throughout his brain. His face gradually darkened, his lips turned black, he was being slowly strangled. Stalin also began vomiting blood at one point. At what seemed like the very last moment, he suddenly opened his eyes and cast a glance over everyone in the room, Svetlana remembered. Then something incomprehensible and awesome happened that to this day I can't forget and don't understand. He suddenly lifted his left hand as though he were pointing to something above and bringing down a curse on us all. And with that, Stalin perished. It only took days after his death for the edifice that Stalin had built to start being undone, strongly suggesting that Soviet leaders really had been conspiring behind his back to plan a post-Stalin USSR. The Gulag system quietly began to be dissembled. And
not this office. It's not worth that great. It's literally a basement of a 190-year-old building.
Inmates were soon released, a mix
Nah,
of political
I'm good on
prisoners
that.
and criminal criminals.
Who knows how long
The
we're
line
even
between
going to
the two
continue
was often
renting
blurred. Publicly,
this
the government
space.
began to acknowledge not just mistakes, but brazen
Not worth
wrongdoing.
it.
The Internal Affairs Ministry released a statement acknowledging that
Now
the
the other
doctors that
office,
had been arrested were arrested without any
where my
legal
desktop
basis
is, you
and
can
admitting
see
that
she
they
had a
been
lot to do with
tortured
that.
into professing their guilt. A government confession without precedent in Soviet history. Pravda referred to the newly freed medical professionals as honest and esteemed figures of our state, while also doing a complete reversal on one demonized Jewish writer, now rehabilitating him as that people's artist of the USSR who has been shamelessly slandered. But as one crisis ended, another began, for it seemed apparent that Beria would be the one to take over for Stalin. Far less paranoid than Stalin had been, Beria nevertheless would have no issue dispatching those who got in his way. Worse, his sadism was well known throughout Kremlin circles. To have escaped Stalin's reign unscathed was no easy task. Now, Soviet leaders found themselves in a position where they might have to live in perpetual fear of what
A lot of weird
tortures
noises here
Beria
at
would
night.
visit upon them and their families.
People been
It
hurt
took fewer than 4
pretty bad
months
here
after
too.
Stalin's death for Beria to be arrested. He was
I don't know how
accused of
many
a slew of
that
crimes
died.
in
But
December
let
1935
me,
trial
there's a
and
little
executed
flyer
immediately.
upstairs. Let me see
It was a
what
conclusion
actual
he
year
knew
it was
all
built.
too well, for it was a fate that he himself had doled out to many thousands upon thousands of innocents. In his place, the comparatively unknown Nikita Khrushchev took on the role as the new leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev was no saint. He too had a fair amount of blood on his hands from when he had been party leader for Moscow, taking part in Stalin's purges. How much guilt can be ascribed to him personally is a matter of debate, for the circumstances very clearly had been kill or be killed. Of all the people who Stalin had feared would betray him, it was Khrushchev who turned out to be the one that Stalin should have been most worried about. After midnight on February 25th, 1956, Khrushchev delivered a speech entitled "On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences" to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It was a 4-hour talk delivered behind closed doors with no journalists or foreigners permitted to attend. Due to the unusual circumstances under which the talk
180
was
years old.
presented, it popularly
1840
became known as the secret
was built.
speech. 3 years after Stalin's death, Khrushchev turned his back not just on Stalin, but on the very idea of Stalinism itself, and from the same rostrum that Stalin had recently occupied. Khrushchev opened by pointing out that it is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person to transform him into a Superman possessing supernatural characteristics akin to those of a god. Such a man supposedly knows everything, sees everything, thinks for everyone, can do anything, is infallible in his behavior. Khrushchev immediately went on to make clear that he was talking specifically about Stalin before denouncing his absolutely insufferable character. Khrushchev acknowledged that whoever opposed Stalin was doomed to removal from the leading collective and to subsequent moral and physical annihilation, and that Stalin's confessions were acquired through physical pressures against the accused. As a result, honest communists were slandered, accusations against them were fabricated, and revolutionary legality was gravely undermined. Enemies, who were actually never enemies, spies, wreckers, etc., but were always honest communists, they were only so stigmatized, and often no longer able to bear barbaric tortures. They charged themselves with all kinds of grave and unlikely crimes.
Better dirty dog.
The man who replaced Stalin condemned his murders and torture. And how is it possible that a person confesses to crimes which he has not committed? Only in one way, because of application of physical methods of pressuring him, tortures, bringing him to a state of unconsciousness, deprivation of his judgment, taking away of his human dignity. In this manner were confessions acquired. Khrushchev did not even denounce bloodshed per se, but argued that it was only to be used in a
This is the
specific
story that they have
context. It
upstairs.
was a bit of historical revisionism that became known as the good Lenin, bad Stalin thesis. Lenin used such methods, however, only against
I'm in the
actual class
basement of that
enemies
little
and
bitty
not against
building there
those who blunder,
in the
who
picture.
err, and whom it was possible to lead through ideological influence and even retain in the leadership. Lenin used severe methods only in the most necessary cases, when the exploiting classes were still in existence and were vigorously opposing the revolution, when the struggle for survival was decidedly assuming the sharpest forms, even including a civil war. But as ex-communist James Burnham pointed out, the good Lenin, bad Stalin thesis was just more propaganda. It should not be supposed that the terror with which communism is linked is a transient phenomenon, a temporary device used and perhaps abused for some special emergency of the revolution. Terror has always been an essential part of communism from the pre-revolutionary days when Stalin, as Koba, was directing the bombings whereby Bolshevik funds were assembled, through the years before 1917 when Lenin was approving the private tortures administered to political dissidents, into every stage of the development of the communist regime in power. Terror is proved by historical experience to be integral to communism, to be in fact the main instrument by which its power is increased and sustained. From the beginning of the communist regime in Russia, every major political and economic turn has been carried through by terror. Khrushchev then gave credence to the conspiracy theory that the murder of Kirov was neither the act of a lone gunman or of those who ended up paying the price for the assassination, but of Stalin himself. He pointed out how the agent assigned to protect Kirov was killed killed in a car accident in which no other occupants of the car were harmed, and how top NKVD officials were executed in 1937, we can assume that they were shot in order to cover the traces of the organizers of Kirov's killing. He went on to question the very basis of the Great Terror. The mass repressions at this time were made under the slogan of a fight against the Trotskyites. Did the Trotskyites at this time actually constitute such a danger to our party and to the Soviet state? Khrushchev went on to answer the question with a firm no. Trotskyism was completely disarmed. Stalin put the party and the NKVD up to the use of mass terror when the exploiting classes had been liquidated in our country and when there were no serious reasons for the use of extraordinary mass terror. Not content to condemn Stalin's crimes internally, he continued to savage him for what happened in the prelude to the Soviet Union entering World War II. When we look at many of our novels, films, and historical scientific studies, said Khrushchev, the role of Stalin in the patriotic war appears to be entirely improbable. Stalin had foreseen everything. In fact, it was Churchill himself who personally
That's the
warned
actual
Stalin
thing that they
the
have upstairs.
Germans
They
had
just
been
essentially
regrouping their
they got
armed
clippings
units with
from
the
it.
intent of attacking the Soviet Union. Khrushchev bluntly regarded the domestic Russian propaganda as nonsense. During the war and after the war, Stalin put forward the thesis that the tragedy which our nation experienced in the first part of the war was the result of the unexpected attack of the Germans against the Soviet Union. But comrades, this is completely untrue. As soon as Hitler came to power in Germany, he assigned to himself the task of liquidating communism. The fascists were saying this openly. They did not hide their plans. When the fascist armies had actually invaded Soviet territory and military operations began, Moscow issued the order that the German fire was not to be returned. Why? It was because Stalin, despite evident facts, thought that the war had not yet started, that this was only provocative action on the part of several undisciplined sections of the German army, and that our reaction might serve as a reason for the Germans to begin the war. And what was the result of this? The worst that we had expected. The Germans surrounded our army concentrations, and consequently we lost hundreds of thousands of our soldiers. This is Stalin's military genius. This is what it cost us. All the more shameful was the fact that after our great victory over the enemy, which cost us so much, Stalin began to downgrade many of the commanders who contributed so much to the victory over the enemy, because Stalin excluded every possibility that services rendered at the front should be credited to anyone but himself. Khrushchev went on to confirm the mass deportation of entire peoples within the Soviet Union, grimly joking that the Ukrainians avoided meeting this fate only because there were too many of them and there was no place to which to deport them. Otherwise, he would have deported them also. Claims which had been made with a straight face under Stalin were now met with laughter, for they were and always had been farcical. Could it be possible that nationalist tendencies grew so much that there was a danger of Georgians leaving the Soviet Union and joining Turkey? Yet this was the accusation under which thousands of alleged Georgian separatists had been killed or exiled. As for the doctor's plot, we found it to be fabricated from beginning to end. Trotsky was incorrect. The party was not, in fact, always right, as the party's main spokesperson made clear over the course of 4 hours. The twist of the whole saga was that the ultimate wrecker was none other than Stalin himself. The way forward was clear. It is necessary for this purpose, Khrushchev concluded, to condemn and to eradicate the cult of the individual, alien to Marxism-Leninism, and not consonant with the principles of party leadership and the norms of party life, and to fight inexorably all attempts at bringing back this practice in one form or another. For many communists around the world, reading the transcript of Khrushchev's speech was the end of the line. They had been content for years to dismiss criticism of the Soviet Union in general, and of Stalin in particular, as capitalist propaganda. Though there were some vague attempts to pretend that reports of Khrushchev's speech were all a forgery or the like, few took such claims to heart. In America and other liberal democracy, party members handed in their cards and quit. It turned out that the criticism had been true, all of it. The Soviet Union was no workers' paradise at all, but a workers' slaughterhouse. The words of Mikhail Bakunin, Marx's foremost rival, came to mind. When the people are being beaten with a stick, they are not much happier if it is called the People's Stick. Throughout the Eastern Bloc, a process of de-Stalinization began. Two exceptions to this were China and North Korea, creating a rift between East and West that never fully healed. But in the other communist nations, Stalin's veneration began to be reversed. The Russian city of Stalingrad had been renamed in his honor in 1925. Khrushchev reverted it to Volgograd. In Prague, there stood a giant 50-foot-tall statue of Stalin leading a group of workers, one that took over 5 years to build. It was dynamited into nothing. Statue after statue, honor after honor, monument after monument, all began to fall. Yet the biggest, most famous communist monument was yet to come, and not in the Soviet Union either. That honor would be visited upon the people of Germany, specifically the citizens of Berlin. Chapter 10. A country where human life is nothing. It would have been considered unthinkable for the simple reason that no one would ever have a reason to think it. How do you divide a city in half? Though city life has many disadvantages, the advantages of cities are plentiful. Cities are centers of art and culture, breeding grounds for new ideas. Cities are centralized locations to do business, which means jobs. Cities are dense, with art and culture and business in somewhat close proximity to one another. The more urbanized the city tends to be, the more tightly packed it ends up being. It takes decades for cities to grow into an integrated whole. Streets feeding into streets, neighborhoods developing their own character. Integration is both a natural and a man-made trend for cities. After World
Chapter
War II,
10.
Germany was divided by the Allies into four.
A country where human life is nothing. All right, we'll come back to this. I'm gonna kill the stream for now, guys. Everyone's kind of dwindled away. You guys all get to watch me eat and listen to me talk to those folks, but I got to get some work done. I'll probably kick back on later, either on mobile or on the desktop when I get to the house. Peace.